The telegram was clutched so tightly in her trembling fingers that the paper had begun to tear at the edges. Lydia Hartwell stood frozen on the wooden platform as the locomotive's steam dissipated into the merciless prairie wind, her entire world collapsing in the span of a single breath. "Trampled by his own horses yesterday afternoon," the station clerk had said, his voice flat and indifferent, as though announcing the price of feed. "Buried him this morning." The man she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry, a rancher named Thomas Brennan, whom she'd never met, whose letters had promised safety and a new beginning, was dead. And she was alone in Dry Creek, a frontier town where women without protection rarely survived long, with exactly $4.17 to her name, no return ticket, and absolutely nowhere left to go. This is the story of how a catastrophic mistake became the most extraordinary journey of one woman's life. A tale of survival, transformation, and unexpected love forged in the unforgiving crucible of the American frontier. If you're watching from a city anywhere in this world, drop a comment below telling me where you are so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The wind that swept across the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1882 carried with it the scent of sage and danger, a warning to those foolish enough to believe the frontier offered easy redemption. Lydia Hartwell learned this truth the moment her worn leather boots touched the warped planks of Dry Creek's only train platform. She was 24 years old, though the journey west had aged her in ways no mirror could measure. Her dark auburn hair, once carefully pinned beneath a modest traveling hat, had come loose during the 3-day rail journey, wild strands whipping across her pale face. Her dress, the nicest one she owned, a faded blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, was creased and dusty, the hem already darkening with the red-brown soil of this God-forsaken country. The train behind her released a final hiss of steam before lurching forward, its massive iron wheels grinding against the rails. Lydia watched it depart with a sensation approaching panic. That train was her last connection to everything familiar, to the cramped Boston tenement where she'd worked her fingers raw in a textile mill, to the narrow streets where at least she'd understood the rules of survival. Here, in this sprawling emptiness, she understood nothing. The platform emptied quickly, a grizzled prospector hauling a pickaxe and bedroll, a woman in a crimson dress who walked with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what she was worth in a town like this, a family, mother, father, 3 children, met by a weathered farmer driving a wagon that had seen better decades. Soon, Lydia stood alone. The town of Dry Creek spread before her like a collection of afterthoughts. 24 buildings constructed from rough-hewn timber and optimism, arranged along a single wide street that turned to soup when it rained and concrete when it didn't. The structures seemed to lean into one another for support. A general store with a false front painted to look grander than it was, a saloon from which the discordant notes of an out-of-tune piano emerged, a bank that was really just a reinforced shed, a livery stable, and at the far end, a whitewashed church that seemed almost defiant in its cleanliness. Beyond the town, the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass broken only by distant buttes that rose like the backbones of buried giants. The sky was impossibly vast, so blue it hurt to look at directly, with clouds that cast shadows racing across the landscape like fleeing animals. Lydia's hand went to the envelope tucked inside her traveling case, the letters from Thomas Brennan, written in a careful, educated script that had surprised her. Most mail-order arrangements involved men who could barely sign their names. But Thomas had quoted Shakespeare, had described the territory with a poet's eye, had promised not just a home, but a partnership. "I have built something here," he'd written in his 3rd letter. "But a ranch is not truly complete without a family to give it purpose. I am not a young man, Miss Hartwell, nor am I given to romantic foolishness, but I believe 2 sensible people might build something worthwhile together in this country. It rewards hard work and punishes weakness with equal measure. If you are willing to work, truly work, then I am willing to offer you a life." She had responded the same day she'd received that letter, her decision made before she'd consciously realized she was making it. The textile mill had been slowly killing her, the work brutal and endless, the pay barely enough to keep her in a boarding house room she shared with 2 other women. When her landlady had informed her that rates were increasing, Lydia had done the arithmetic and understood with perfect clarity that she was 6 months from starvation or worse. Thomas Brennan's offer had been a lifeline thrown across 2,000 miles. Now that lifeline was buried in Dry Creek's new cemetery, and she was drowning. "You'll be Miss Hartwell, then." The voice was male, gravelly, and came from behind her. Lydia spun, her heart hammering, one hand instinctively clutching her traveling case tighter. The man was ancient, or seemed it, though she'd learned that the frontier aged people deceptively. He might have been 50 or 70, his face weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, his beard more gray than brown. He wore dusty canvas trousers held up with suspenders, a shirt that might once have been white, and a battered hat that had long ago abandoned any pretense of shape. "I am," Lydia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "And you are?" "Ned Parsons? Station clerk, telegraph operator, and postmaster when the mood strikes me." He studied her with watery blue eyes that held neither warmth nor hostility, just the flat assessment of a man who'd seen too many people arrive with dreams and depart in coffins. "Got some news regarding your situation." "I'm aware," Lydia said quietly. "You already informed me that Mr. Brennan is deceased." "Trampled by his own horses," Ned confirmed, as though she might have forgotten in the past 5 minutes. "Damn fool tried to break a Mustang stallion by himself. 73 years old and still acting like a young buck. Horse threw him, then the others spooked, and—" He made a stomping gesture that made Lydia's stomach turn. "Wasn't pretty, from what I heard." Lydia closed her eyes briefly. She'd never met Thomas Brennan, had only his letters to construct an image of the man, but she'd memorized those letters during the long train journey. She'd imagined their first meeting, had rehearsed possible conversations, had tried to prepare herself for marriage to a stranger. She'd been terrified, yes, but also cautiously hopeful. Now she felt nothing but a hollowness that threatened to consume her entirely. "The circuit preacher did the service this morning," Ned continued. "Some of the other ranchers came in for it. Thomas didn't have family, not that anyone knew of. You're the closest thing to kin that showed up." "I see," Lydia managed. "Thank you for informing me." She had no idea what to say next, what to do next. The script she'd written for her new life had been torn to pieces before the first act could even begin. Ned shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, miss, I don't mean to be indelicate, but what are your plans?" Lydia's mind was utterly blank. "I'm not certain." "The thing is," Ned said, his voice taking on an apologetic tone that somehow made everything worse, "Thomas already paid for your ticket west, but there ain't no return fare waiting, and the next train east doesn't come through for another week, and when it does—" He trailed off meaningfully. "I understand," Lydia said, though she didn't. Not fully, not yet. Her brain was still trying to process the catastrophic mathematics of her situation. $4.17. A week until the next train. No guaranteed ticket even then. "There's a boarding house," Ned offered, gesturing vaguely toward the town. "Mrs. Fletcher runs it. $3 a week, meals included. She's particular about her tenants, but seeing as you're a respectable lady and all—" $3 a week. She had enough for 1 week, with $1 to spare. And then what? Even if she could somehow secure passage east, what waited for her back in Boston? The boarding house where she'd lived had already rented her room to someone else. The textile mill wouldn't take her back. There were 10 desperate women for every position. She'd be on the street within days, and a woman alone on Boston's streets had few options, none of them acceptable. The frontier might be deadly, but at least here, death would come from honest causes. Weather, disease, accident, rather than the slow, soul-destroying degradation of urban poverty. "I'll speak with Mrs. Fletcher," Lydia said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Parsons." Ned nodded, clearly relieved to have discharged his duty. Boarding house is that 2-story building past the general store. You can't miss it. And miss? He paused, seeming to struggle with whether to continue. "I'm sorry about Thomas. He was a good man, honest and fair. He would have treated you right." Lydia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She waited until Ned had retreated to his station office before allowing herself to truly comprehend her situation. She was alone in a frontier town where she knew no one. Her money would last perhaps 10 days if she was extraordinarily careful. She had no skills that would be valuable here. She could work a power loom and keep decent accounts, neither of which seemed relevant in a place where survival depended on cattle, mining, or providing services to men who worked with cattle and mines. The wind picked up, colder now, carrying the promise of the brutal winter everyone said was coming. Lydia picked up her traveling case, containing everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, undergarments, a pair of worn boots, her mother's Bible, and the letters from Thomas Brennan, and began walking toward town. The main street was busier now, mid-afternoon commerce in full swing. Cowboys on horseback moved past her with barely a glance. A wagon loaded with fence posts nearly ran her down. She had to jump aside, her boots slipping in the loose dirt. A dog barked aggressively until its owner called it back. Everything was louder, rougher, more immediate than Boston had been. There, poverty had been quiet and gray, a slow suffocation. Here, it seemed, even destitution would be violent and swift. The boarding house was easy to identify, exactly as Ned had described. It was the most respectable-looking building on the street, with actual glass windows instead of oiled paper, and a small porch where several rocking chairs sat empty. A hand-painted sign hung above the door: Fletcher's Rooms, respectable lodgers only. Lydia climbed the 3 steps to the porch, set down her case, and knocked. The woman who answered was in her 50s, rail-thin, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. She wore a severe black dress buttoned to her throat, and her eyes, sharp, calculating, missing nothing, swept over Lydia in a single comprehensive assessment. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Lydia asked. "I am." The woman's voice matched her appearance, clipped, no nonsense, brooking no foolishness. "My name is Lydia Hartwell. I've just arrived on the afternoon train, and Mr. Parsons suggested I speak with you about lodging." Mrs. Fletcher's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or pity, though she seemed like a woman who would consider pity a weakness. "You're the one?" she said flatly. "The mail-order bride for Thomas Brennan. News traveled fast in small towns." "I was," Lydia confirmed. "Obviously, circumstances have changed." "Obviously." Mrs. Fletcher stepped back slightly, allowing a sliver of space. "How much money do you have?" The directness was startling, but Lydia appreciated it. At least there was no false sympathy, no performance of concern. $4. "And how long do you plan to stay in Dry Creek?" Lydia hesitated. "I'm not certain. Until I can secure passage east, I suppose." Mrs. Fletcher made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "And you think $4 will accomplish that? The train ticket alone costs $12, assuming there's even space available. You'll be waiting weeks, maybe a month, for a seat." The numbers hit Lydia like physical blows. $12, 4 weeks. $3 per week for lodging alone, not counting food, not counting anything else she might need. The mathematics were impossible. "I see," Lydia said quietly. "Then I'm afraid I won't be able to afford your boarding house after all. Thank you for your time." She turned to leave, her mind already racing through increasingly desperate alternatives. Perhaps she could sleep in the train station. Perhaps Ned Parsons would allow her to work in exchange for shelter. Perhaps— "Wait." Lydia stopped, not turning around. "I'm not running a charity," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice still hard, "but I'm also not heartless. You can stay 3 nights for your $4. That gives you time to figure out your situation. After that, you're on your own. And while you're here, you'll help with the laundry and cooking. I don't tolerate idleness." 3 days. It was more than Lydia had any right to expect, and she knew it. "Thank you," she said, turning back to face the older woman. "That's very generous." "It's not generous," Mrs. Fletcher corrected sharply. "It's practical. If I throw you out today, you'll likely end up at the saloon, and that reflects poorly on the whole town. 3 days is enough time for you to either find employment or get yourself out of Dry Creek before you become everyone's problem. Now come inside before you let all the heat out." The interior of this boarding house was as severe as its owner. Simple furniture, bare walls, everything clean and functional, but entirely without warmth. Mrs. Fletcher led Lydia up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, down a hallway past several closed doors, to a small room at the end. "This was going to be storage," Mrs. Fletcher said, opening the door to reveal a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a washstand. But it'll do for 3 nights. Outhouse is out back. Meals are at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Miss either one and you don't eat. Laundry is Mondays and Thursdays. Questions? No, ma'am, thank you. Mrs. Fletcher nodded once and left, closing the door behind her. Lydia set her case on the bed and sat beside it, her hands folded in her lap, and finally allowed herself to fully comprehend the disaster of her situation. She had 3 days to find employment in a town where the only jobs available to women were teaching school, which required credentials she didn't possess, or working in the saloon, which meant something far worse than serving drinks. 3 days to somehow earn enough money to return to a city where she had nothing and no one. 3 days before she became another cautionary tale, another failed dreamer who'd believed the frontier offered opportunities it never intended to provide. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her face as the enormity of her mistake crashed over her. She'd gambled everything on Thomas Brennan's letters, on the possibility of a better life, and she'd lost before the game had even begun. Outside her narrow window, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the endless prairie in shades of amber and blood. Somewhere out there, Thomas Brennan was buried in unfamiliar soil. His dreams of partnership and family ended beneath the hooves of spooked horses. And here, in this tiny room in a town called Dry Creek, Lydia Hartwell faced her first night in the West, alone, nearly penniless, and with absolutely no idea how she would survive the morning. The dining room of Fletcher's boarding house accommodated 12 guests at a long pine table, though only 7 seats were occupied that evening. Mrs. Fletcher presided at the head like a stern magistrate, her sharp eyes monitoring every movement, every bite, as though eating were a privilege that could be revoked for infractions. Lydia sat at the far end, trying to make herself invisible, picking at a plate of boiled potatoes and tough beef that tasted of nothing but salt and disappointment. The other boarders were men, mostly, miners and cowpunchers who shoveled food into their mouths with the efficiency of people who viewed eating as fuel rather than pleasure. The sole exception was a woman near Lydia's age, perhaps a year or 2 younger, with bright blonde hair and an expression of permanent amusement, as though the entire world were a private joke she alone understood. She'd introduced herself as Annie Caldwell, a dressmaker's assistant, and had been the only person to offer Lydia a genuine smile. "Don't mind the accommodations," Annie whispered while Mrs. Fletcher was occupied scolding a miner for reaching across the table instead of asking for the breadbasket. "The food's terrible, the beds are worse, but it's the most respectable place in town for women without husbands," which, frankly, isn't saying much. Lydia managed a weak smile. "How long have you been here?" 6 months. Came out from Missouri with my sister and her husband. They're homesteading about 30 miles north. I stayed in town because I can actually sew, and Mrs. Patterson at the general store needed help with alterations." Annie took a bite of potato, made a face, and continued. "I heard about what happened. Thomas Brennan. I'm sorry. Did you know him?" "Not well. He came to town maybe once a month for supplies. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but people respected him." Annie's voice dropped even lower. "I also heard you're the bride he sent for." Lydia nodded, not trusting herself to elaborate. "That's rotten luck," Annie said with blunt sympathy. "What are you going to do?" It was the question Lydia had been avoiding all afternoon, had pushed to the back of her mind while she'd unpacked her meager belongings and washed her face in cold water from the basin and tried to convince herself that something, somehow, would present itself as a solution. "I don't know," she admitted. Annie studied her for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Tomorrow morning, come with me to the general store. Mrs. Patterson is always complaining about needing help with the accounts. Her husband can't add 2 numbers together without getting 3 different answers. If you can keep books, maybe she'd hire you." "I can keep books," Lydia said, hope flickering dangerously in her chest. She'd managed the household accounts for the boarding house in Boston, had kept track of every penny in an era when pennies mattered. "I'm quite good with figures, actually." "Then we'll talk to Mrs. Patterson first thing. Can't promise anything, but it's worth trying." Annie pushed her plate away, the food barely touched. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to pretend I'm still hungry enough to suffer through whatever Mrs. Fletcher is calling dessert." Lydia watched Annie navigate the social dynamics of the table with easy confidence. chatting with the miners, deflecting crude comments with humor, maintaining respectability while also being friendly. It was a skill Lydia had never mastered. She'd always been too serious, too reserved, too aware of the narrow margins that separated respectable poverty from destitution. After dinner, she retreated to her small room and lit the single candle Mrs. Fletcher had grudgingly provided. By its flickering light, she reread Thomas Brennan's letters, trying to understand the shape of the life she'd almost had. The ranch is called the Standing Rock, he'd written, named for a peculiar formation on the north ridge that looks like a man standing watch. It's 2,300 acres, mostly grassland suitable for cattle, with a good creek that runs year-round. The house is modest but sound. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor with a stone fireplace. I built it myself 15 years ago, and it's survived droughts, floods, and harsh winters. It will protect you as it has protected me. She would never see the Standing Rock Ranch, would never know if the house was truly as sound as Thomas had claimed, would never stand on the North Ridge and look at the peculiar rock formation. That life had been erased before it could begin. Lydia folded the letters carefully and returned them to her case, then undressed and climbed into the narrow bed. The mattress was thin, the blanket threadbare, and through the walls she could hear the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night. Footsteps, muffled conversations, somewhere a man coughing violently. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind refused to quiet. Tomorrow she would speak with Mrs. Patterson at the general store. If there was no work there, she would try elsewhere. The church, perhaps, or one of the ranchers' wives might need domestic help. She had 3 days to find a miracle. And if the miracle didn't come, then she would have to make choices she couldn't yet bring herself to contemplate. Morning arrived too early and too cold, announced by Mrs. Fletcher's sharp knock on each door at precisely 5:30. "Breakfast in 30 minutes," the landlady called through the thin wood. "Anyone not seated at 6 goes hungry." Lydia dressed quickly in her second dress, a gray wool that was marginally less travel-stained than the blue cotton, and made her way downstairs. Breakfast was porridge, dense bread, and bitter coffee that tasted like it had been made from grounds used 3 times already. Annie appeared at 6:15, looking bright-eyed despite the early hour, and waited while Lydia forced down enough food to qualify as having eaten. "Ready?" Annie asked. "As I'll ever be." They walked together through the morning chill. Dry Creek was quieter at this hour. Most businesses still shuttered, though smoke rose from the chimney of the blacksmith's forge, and the saloon door stood inexplicably open, a drunk sleeping on the porch as though he'd simply collapsed mid-journey and decided to rest where he fell. The general store occupied a prominent corner location, its false front painted with elaborate lettering. Patterson's General Merchandise, quality goods, fair prices. Through the large front window, Lydia could see shelves stocked with everything from canned foods to fabric bolts to farming implements. A bell jangled as they entered. The interior was a chaotic collection of necessities and luxuries organized according to a logic only the proprietors understood. Barrels of flour and sugar stood beside displays of hair ribbons. Bridles hung from ceiling hooks above jars of pickled vegetables. The smell was a mixture of leather, tobacco, coffee, and something vaguely medicinal that might have been liniment. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 40s, heavy-set, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. This, Lydia assumed, was Mrs. Patterson. "Annie," she called, "you're early. The alterations aren't due until this afternoon." "I'm not here for work," Annie said cheerfully. "I'm here to introduce you to someone who might solve your accounting problems. Mrs. Patterson, this is Lydia Hartwell. She's new in town and looking for employment, and she's excellent with numbers." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted immediately from friendly to cautious. "Is that so?" Lydia stepped forward, forcing herself to project confidence she didn't feel. "I managed household accounts in Boston for 3 years. I can maintain ledgers, balance books, and prepare financial summaries. I'm thorough, accurate, and quick." "Boston," Mrs. Patterson repeated, her tone unreadable. "You're a long way from Massachusetts, Miss Hartwell." "I am." "And why exactly are you looking for work in Dry Creek? Most Boston ladies who come west have husbands to support them." There was no point in lying. Everyone in town would know her story by evening if they didn't already. "I came to marry Thomas Brennan. I arrived yesterday and learned he'd died the day before." Now, I need employment. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. I heard about Thomas. Terrible business. He was a good customer, always paid on time. She paused, studying Lydia with the same comprehensive assessment Mrs. Fletcher had employed. You say you can balance books? I can. My husband keeps the store accounts, and he's… Mrs. Patterson sighed. Well, he's a wonderful man and excellent at everything except arithmetic. Last month, we somehow ended up with 300 pounds of sugar we never ordered and no record of where it came from. The month before that, we nearly ran out of flour because the inventory was wrong. I've been after him for years to let someone else handle the numbers, but he's stubborn. Hope flickered again, stronger now. I could review your current system and make recommendations. No obligation, just let me look at your ledgers for an hour, and I'll show you what I can do. Mrs. Patterson glanced at Annie, who nodded enthusiastically, then back at Lydia. All right, she said finally, but I can't pay much. $1 a week, plus you can take your lunch here. Nothing fancy, just bread and cheese, but it's filling. And I'd need you for 3 days a week, maybe 4 during busy periods. $1 a week. It was something, at least. Not enough to survive on alone, but combined with other work with extreme frugality. I accept, Lydia said quickly, before Mrs. Patterson could reconsider. When would you like me to start? Now's as good as any. Come around back. The accounts are in my husband's office, and I warn you, it's chaos. Frank means well, but organization isn't his strength. Mrs. Patterson led Lydia through a narrow door behind the counter into a cramped office that was, indeed, chaos. Papers covered every surface. Ledgers lay open, pages filled with crossed-out numbers and margin notes. A filing system appeared to involve stuffing receipts into whatever drawer was closest. I'll leave you to it, Mrs. Patterson said, sounding almost embarrassed. Holler if you need anything. Lydia stood alone in the office and took a deep breath. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. It took her less than 5 minutes to understand the core problem. There was no consistent system. Frank Patterson had apparently invented his own method of bookkeeping that involved recording transactions in whichever ledger was closest, cross-referencing nothing and hoping memory would fill the gaps. It took her another hour to devise a solution. When Mrs. Patterson returned, Lydia had reorganized the desk, separated the ledgers by function, one for sales, one for purchases, one for inventory, and had begun creating a master index that would allow quick cross-referencing. Merciful heavens, Mrs. Patterson breathed. You did all this in an hour? I've made a start, Lydia said modestly. The system needs complete restructuring, but once it's in place, maintaining it will be simple. An hour a day, perhaps 2 during inventory periods. Show me. Lydia walked Mrs. Patterson through her proposed system, explaining how each transaction would be recorded, how the ledgers would interact, how end-of-month reconciliations would work. The older woman listened intently, asking intelligent questions, occasionally saying, "Oh," when a particularly elegant solution revealed itself. This is remarkable, Mrs. Patterson said finally. And you can really do this for $1 a week? I can, Lydia confirmed. What she didn't say was that $1 a week wasn't enough, that she was still going to be short, that 3 days of work wouldn't solve her fundamental problem. But it was a start. Then you're hired. Can you come tomorrow? Same time? Of course. They shook hands. Mrs. Patterson's grip was firm, calloused, and Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Dry Creek, the faint possibility that she might actually survive this. Outside, Annie was waiting, practically bouncing with excitement. Well, did she hire you? She did, $1 a week. Annie's face fell slightly. Oh, well, it's something, isn't it? It is, Lydia agreed, trying to sound more optimistic than she felt. They walked together back toward the boarding house, Annie chattering about various town personalities, pointing out businesses, and explaining their reputations. The blacksmith was honest but expensive. The doctor was competent but drank. The saloon owner was mean when sober and worse when drunk. As they passed the church, the door opened and a man emerged, tall, lean, wearing dark trousers and a simple white shirt despite the cold. He had a weathered face and intense eyes that seemed to notice everything, and when those eyes landed on Lydia, she felt uncomfortably seen. "That's Reverend Blackwood," Annie whispered. "He does circuit riding, covers about 6 small towns and settlements. Only in Dry Creek every third Sunday. He's—" She paused, searching for words. "Well, he's not like most preachers. Actually listens when people talk." The Reverend tipped his hat as they passed. "Good morning, ladies." "Good morning, Reverend," Annie replied. Lydia nodded but said nothing. She had complicated feelings about religion. Her mother had been devout, had died praying for relief that never came, and Lydia had lost faith watching poverty slowly consume the woman who'd raised her. They continued past, but Lydia felt the Reverend's eyes on her back, that same uncomfortable sensation of being truly observed. "He'll want to talk to you eventually," Annie said. "About Thomas, probably. Reverend Blackwood handles most of the funerals, even if he wasn't there for the actual service. He likes to check on people after." Lydia didn't respond. She was too busy calculating how many hours she'd need to work, how many jobs she'd need to cobble together, to earn enough to either stay in Dry Creek or afford passage east. The mathematics were still impossible, but at least now they were slightly less impossible than they'd been yesterday. That afternoon, Lydia walked the length of Dry Creek's main street, methodically visiting every business to inquire about work. At each establishment, she explained her situation. Recent arrival, experienced with accounts and general domestic tasks, desperately seeking employment. The responses varied from sympathetic rejection to outright hostility. The baker already had help from his 3 daughters. The blacksmith couldn't afford an employee. The hotel, really just a rooming house with pretensions, employed one elderly man for everything from cooking to cleaning, and he'd been there for 20 years and wasn't about to share his position. At the saloon, the owner, a thick-necked man named Garrett, with cold eyes and breath that smelled of whiskey at 3 in the afternoon, looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "I could use a girl," he said slowly. "Pretty thing like you would draw customers." "I'm looking for respectable work," Lydia said firmly. "Cleaning, cooking, accounts?" Garrett laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Darling, in Dry Creek, the only respectable work for a woman is teaching school, and that position's been filled for 3 years. Everything else, he shrugged meaningfully. Well, let's just say you might want to reconsider what respectable means out here." Lydia left before he could say anything else. By sunset, she'd exhausted every option in town. The mathematics were clearer now and brutally simple. $1 a week from the general store would keep her fed but not sheltered. Mrs. Fletcher's room, if she could even keep it beyond the 3 days already negotiated, cost $3 weekly. She was still $2 short every week, and that was assuming she ate nothing beyond the bread and cheese Mrs. Patterson had offered for lunch. Back in her small room at the boarding house, Lydia sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands. They were already rougher than they'd been in Boston, the skin dried by the harsh climate, calluses forming from work she wasn't accustomed to. She thought about Thomas Brennan's letters, about the life that might have been. The Standing Rock Ranch, 2,300 acres of grassland, a modest but sound house, a partnership with a man who at least respected her intelligence. All of it gone. There was a soft knock on her door. "Yes?" "It's Annie. Can I come in?" Lydia opened the door. Annie entered, closing it behind her, her expression unusually serious. "I've been thinking about your situation," Annie said without preamble, "and I might have an idea, but you're not going to like it. At this point, I'll consider anything short of working at Garrett's saloon." Annie sat on the bed, patting the space beside her. Lydia joined her, and they sat like conspirators, voices low despite the thin walls. "There's a rancher named Wyatt Mercer," Annie began. "Has a spread about 15 miles northwest of town. Big operation, cattle, horses, the works. He's got a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" "Not that kind," Annie said quickly. "He's not like Garrett, but he's hard, doesn't suffer fools, doesn't really talk to people much. Most of the cowboys who work for him last maybe a season before they can't take his standards anymore." She paused. "But he's fair, pays well. And word is he was friends with Thomas Brennan." Lydia's pulse quickened. "Friends?" "Neighbors, anyway. The Standing Rock and Mercer's ranch, he calls it the High Valley. They share a boundary. Thomas mentioned you once to Mercer, apparently.
Told him he was bringing out a wife, someone who could help run the ranch properly. How do you know all this? Annie smiled. I'm a dressmaker's assistant. You wouldn't believe what people say while they're being fitted for trousers. Mercer was in town last week getting a new pair of work pants.
He and Mrs. Patterson were talking, and she mentioned that Thomas seemed excited about his upcoming marriage. Mercer didn't say much, but I got the impression he approved. I still don't understand what this has to do with my situation. Mercer was at Thomas's funeral. He's the one who paid for it, actually. Dug into his own pocket to make sure Thomas got a proper service. And apparently, at the service, someone mentioned that you were arriving on the afternoon train. Annie's voice dropped even lower. Lydia, Mercer knows you exist. He knows you traveled 2,000 miles to marry his friend, and from what I can tell, he's the kind of man who feels responsible for things. Understanding dawned slowly. You think he might offer me work? I think he might. The High Valley is a big operation, but Mercer lives alone, has a foreman and a handful of cowboys who bunk in the outbuildings, but the main house is just him. He does his own cooking, his own cleaning, and from what I hear, the ranch accounts are a disaster. A man like that, with land to manage and cattle to tend, he doesn't have time for paperwork. It was possible. More than possible. It was the first genuinely hopeful option Lydia had encountered. How would I even approach him, she asked. He comes to town every Saturday for supplies. Arrives around mid-morning, does his business at Patterson's, sometimes at the bank, then heads back before dark. Annie glanced at the window where the last light was fading. Tomorrow's Friday. If you wait at the general store Saturday morning, you could speak with him then. Lydia nodded slowly, her mind already working through possibilities, rehearsing what she might say. Thank you, she told Annie. Truly, you've been kinder to me than you had any reason to be. Annie squeezed her hand. We women have to look out for each other out here. The frontier's hard enough without us fighting amongst ourselves. She stood, moving toward the door. Get some rest. Saturday's your best shot, so you'll want to make a good impression. After Annie left, Lydia prepared for bed, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she lay in the darkness and thought about a man named Wyatt Mercer, hard, fair, responsible, and wondered if he might be her salvation. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that promised a harsh winter to come. Lydia, dressed in her blue cotton dress, now carefully washed and pressed, her hair pinned back severely, every inch of her appearance calculated to project competence and respectability. She arrived at Patterson's General Merchandise at 8 o'clock, 2 hours before Wyatt Mercer was expected. Mrs. Patterson was surprised but pleased to see her, and Lydia threw herself into the account books with the same focused intensity she'd demonstrated 2 days before. At 10:30, the bell above the door jangled. Lydia looked up from the ledger where she'd been reconciling September's invoices and saw him immediately. Wyatt Mercer was not what she'd expected. Annie's description, hard, serious, demanding, had led Lydia to imagine someone older, perhaps weathered and severe like Ned Parsons. But Mercer was young, maybe early 30s, tall and lean in the way of men who worked physically every day of their lives. He wore canvas work pants, a heavy flannel shirt, and a hat that had seen hard use. His face was angular, tanned dark by constant sun exposure, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. His eyes, when they swept across the store's interior, were the color of steel, gray and assessing and utterly without softness. He moved like a man who owned the ground he walked on, not from arrogance but from a bone-deep confidence earned through surviving what the land threw at him. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back room, already calling out a greeting. Mr. Mercer, right on schedule as always. Your order's ready. I've got it boxed up and back. Appreciate it, Eleanor. His voice was deep, rough-edged, economical. He didn't waste words. Also need 20 feet of rope and another box of rifle cartridges. 30-06. I'll get Frank to gather those. Should just take a few minutes. She hesitated, then glanced meaningfully at Lydia. Mr. Mercer, have you met our new bookkeeper? This is Miss Lydia Hartwell. Mercer's eyes shifted to Lydia, and she felt the full weight of his attention. It was like being examined by a particularly intelligent predator, not threatening precisely, but absolutely thorough. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. This was her moment. Lydia stood, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly, despite the urge to look away. Mr. Mercer, I wonder if I might have a word with you. It concerns Thomas Brennan. Something flickered across Mercer's expression. Recognition, she thought, or perhaps acknowledgement that he'd been expecting this conversation. All right, he said simply. Mrs. Patterson, reading the room with practiced skill, retreated diplomatically. I'll just go help Frank with that rope and ammunition. Take your time. They stood facing each other across the counter, and Lydia realized she had no prepared speech, no careful rhetoric. She had only the truth, raw and desperate. I'm the woman Thomas sent for, she said. I arrived on the afternoon train 3 days ago, 4 hours after his funeral. I have $4 to my name, a room at the boarding house for one more night, and no way to return east even if I wanted to. Mrs. Patterson has hired me for $1 a week, which isn't enough to survive on. I'm told you and Thomas were friends, and I'm asking, her voice caught slightly, but she pushed through, if you might have work for me at your ranch. Mercer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence stretched between them for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. What kind of work are you offering to do? He asked finally. Whatever you need. I can keep accounts. I'm good with numbers and organization. I can cook, though I'll admit my skills are basic. I can clean, manage a household, do laundry. I'm strong, I learn quickly, and I work hard. You ever been on a ranch before? No. Ever worked with cattle? Horses? No. Can you shoot? No. Mercer's expression didn't change, but Lydia detected something that might have been amusement in his eyes. So you're asking me to hire you for a job you've never done, on a ranch you've never seen, doing work you don't know how to do. When he put it that way, it sounded absurd, but Lydia refused to back down. I'm asking you to take a chance on someone who has nowhere else to turn, she said steadily. Thomas thought I could help run his ranch. He believed I was capable. I'm asking you to have the same faith. Thomas was 73 and lonely. Faith came easy to him. The words were harsh, but not cruel. They were simply honest, and Lydia found she respected that more than false sympathy. Then don't have faith, she countered. Hire me on a trial basis, 1 month. If I'm not worth what you pay me, I'll leave with no complaint. Mercer studied her for a long moment, and Lydia had the uncomfortable sensation that he could see directly into her soul, could read every desperate calculation, every silent prayer for salvation. Why did Thomas send for you? He asked abruptly. What was in your letters that made him think you'd survive out here? The question surprised her. I told him the truth, that I'd worked in a textile mill since I was 16, that I'd managed household accounts, that I wasn't afraid of hard work. I told him I wanted a partnership, not just a provider. And what did he tell you? That he'd built something worth building on, that the ranch needed a family to give it purpose. She paused. He quoted Shakespeare. That definitely got a reaction. Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly. Did he now? Hamlet, this above all, to thine own self be true. Thomas always did have peculiar taste in quotes. Mercer was quiet again, thinking. Then, the High Valley's 15 miles from town. You'd be living on the ranch, not coming and going. It's isolated and winter's coming. Once the snow hits, you might not see another person for weeks besides me and the hands. I understand. The work's hard. I don't tolerate laziness, complaining, or incompetence. I wouldn't expect you to. And I can't pay much. Room and board, plus $2 a week. That's all I can spare right now. $2. Combined with the dollar from Mrs. Patterson, it was $3 weekly, exactly what she needed to keep the boarding house room if she had to, though living on the ranch would eliminate that expense entirely. It was barely survival wages, but it was survival. I accept, Lydia said immediately. Mercer nodded slowly. All right then, 1 month trial. I'll be heading back to the ranch this afternoon. Can you be ready to leave by 2 o'clock? I can be ready in an hour. 2 o'clock is fine. Meet me here. He turned toward the back room, clearly considering the matter settled, then paused and looked back at her. Fair warning, Miss Hartwell. The High Valley isn't the Standing Rock. Thomas ran a gentleman's ranch, kept things comfortable. I run a working operation. If you're expecting easy living, you'd best reconsider now. I'm not expecting easy anything, Mr. Mercer. I'm just expecting a chance. Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. 2 o'clock, he repeated, and disappeared into the back of the store. Lydia stood alone in the sudden silence, her heart hammering so hard she could hear her pulse in her ears. She had a job. She had a place to go. She had, against every impossible odd, a future. It might not be the future she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train in Boston, and Wyatt Mercer was definitely not Thomas Brennan, was harder, younger, more demanding, but it was something, and right now something was everything. She allowed herself 30 seconds of pure relief, then hurried back to the boarding house to pack. The wagon Wyatt Mercer drove was built for function, not comfort. A flatbed with wooden sides pulled by two muscular draft horses whose breath steamed in the cold afternoon air. Lydia's traveling case and the supply boxes from Patterson's store filled the back, leaving just enough room for her to perch on a folded blanket Mercer had tossed in without ceremony. "It's a 2-hour ride," he said as they left Dry Creek behind, the wagon wheels cutting deep tracks in the dirt road. "Road gets rough about halfway. Hold on to the side rails." Lydia gripped the weathered wood and watched the town disappear behind them. The prairie opened up in every direction, vast and empty, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The grass rippled in waves driven by wind that never seemed to stop, and the sky stretched overhead like an inverted ocean, so blue it made her eyes ache. Mercer drove in silence, his attention fixed on the horses and the rutted path ahead. He sat with the ease of someone who'd spent more of his life on a wagon seat than in a proper chair, his hands light on the reins, his body automatically adjusting to every bump and sway. Lydia tried to match his silence, but after an hour of nothing but wind and the creak of wagon wheels, her curiosity overcame her caution. "How long have you known Thomas Brennan?" she asked. Mercer didn't look at her, but his jaw tightened slightly. 15 years, give or take. He was already established when I bought the High Valley. Helped me learn the territory, which water sources were reliable, which passes got snowed in first. Good neighbor. I'm sorry for your loss. He lived longer than most out here, died doing what he loved. There's worse ways to go. His tone was matter of fact, not callous exactly, but without the performance of grief. Still damn foolish of him, trying to break a Mustang at his age. The letters he sent me, Lydia ventured, he seemed very thoughtful, educated. Thomas read more books than the rest of the county combined. Had a whole shelf of them. Shakespeare, Dickens, some Greek fellow whose name I can't remember. Used to quote poetry while we were mending fence. Mercer's voice held a note of wry affection. Drove the ranch hands crazy, but he didn't care. Said just because a man worked with cattle didn't mean he had to think like one. Lydia found herself smiling despite everything. He quoted Hamlet in his third letter to me. That sounds like Thomas. Mercer was quiet for a moment, then added, He talked about you, you know. Last time I saw him, maybe 2 weeks ago. He rode over to help with a fence line, and he mentioned he'd sent for a bride. Said he'd found someone sensible, someone who wouldn't faint at the sight of honest work. Did he seem happy about it? Happy as I'd ever seen him. Little nervous too, I think, though he tried to hide it. Kept asking whether he should paint the house, whether the furniture was too rough, whether a woman from back east would think his place was civilized enough. Mercer shook his head. I told him any woman who'd agree to marry a stranger and travel 2,000 miles probably wasn't expecting luxury. The words settled between them, and Lydia felt the weight of the life that had been stolen from her. From both of them, really. Thomas had prepared for her arrival, had worried about making her comfortable, had died before any of it could matter. What happens to his ranch now? She asked. That's complicated. Thomas didn't have family, no will that anyone knows of. The land will probably get tied up in territorial court for a year or more, then auctioned off to pay any outstanding debts. Most likely one of the bigger operations will buy it, fold it into their spread. He glanced at her briefly. Why? You thinking of claiming it somehow? No, Lydia said quickly. I was just curious. It seemed like he built something meaningful there. He did. 20 years of work, all of it about to belong to someone who never knew him. Mercer's voice was flat, but Lydia detected an undercurrent of anger. That's the frontier for you. Build something with your bare hands, and the moment you're gone, it's like you never existed. They rode in silence after that, the weight of mortality hanging over them both. The road, barely more than wheel ruts through the grass, grew rougher as Mercer had warned, forcing Lydia to grip the rails tighter as the wagon jolted over rocks and ruts. Her back ached, her hands were numb from the cold, and every bone in her body felt bruised. But she didn't complain. If Mercer noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. The sun was well past its peak when the landscape began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, Lydia could see a line of mountains, their peaks already white with early snow. The grass here was taller, lusher, and she caught glimpses of a creek winding through the valley, its water catching the afternoon light. "That's the High Valley," Mercer said, gesturing ahead with his chin. "Creek runs year-round, never freezes completely even in the worst winters. That's why I bought this land. Water's more valuable than gold out here." As they crested a rise, Lydia saw the ranch spread out below them. It was larger than she'd expected. Not just a house and barn, but a small compound of buildings arranged around a central yard. The main house was a sturdy two-story structure built from timber and stone, with a wide porch and a stone chimney from which no smoke currently rose. Behind it stood a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings that might have been bunkhouses or storage sheds, and a series of corrals where horses moved restlessly. Beyond the buildings, the land rolled away in every direction, marked by fence lines that stretched to the horizon. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark stones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Lydia had no frame of reference for estimating such things. "How much land is this?" she asked, awed despite herself. 4,000 acres, give or take. Been building it for 12 years. There was quiet pride in his voice. Started with 800 acres and 20 head of cattle. Now I'm running near 1,500 head plus the horses. 1,500 cattle. The number was incomprehensible to Lydia, who'd lived her entire life in cities where the most livestock she'd ever seen was the occasional dairy cow. As they descended toward the ranch, 3 men emerged from the barn, all of them stopping to watch the approaching wagon with open curiosity. They were young, weathered, dressed in the canvas and leather uniform of working cowboys. One of them, stocky, with a beard that looked like it had never met a razor, called out as Mercer pulled the horses to a stop. "Boss, didn't expect you back before dark." "Finished my business early," Mercer said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "We get the fence on the north pasture finished?" "Done yesterday. Collins is writing the boundary now, making sure everything's secure." The bearded man's eyes shifted to Lydia with unconcealed curiosity. "You bring back a guest?" Mercer walked around to the back of the wagon and began unloading supply boxes with efficient movements. "This is Miss Hartwell. She'll be working here, managing the house accounts, cooking, general domestic work. Miss Hartwell, that's Pete Morrison, my foreman." He gestured to the other 2 men in turn. "That's Jack Reed and Danny Cooper. They work for me, which means they'll treat you with respect or find employment elsewhere. Understood?" All 3 men nodded, though their expressions ranged from confusion to barely suppressed amusement. Lydia understood immediately. A woman arriving on the ranch, hired for domestic work, was unusual enough to be gossiped for weeks. "Ma'am," Pete said, touching his hat brim. He was older than the others, maybe 40, with intelligent eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd learned to think before speaking. "Welcome to the High Valley." "Thank you," Lydia said, accepting his hand when he offered to help her down from the wagon. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit solid ground. 2 hours of being jostled had left her muscles stiff and uncooperative. "Pete, get these supplies into the barn." Mercer was already issuing orders, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Jack, Danny, there's feed coming in on Tuesday. I need the east barn cleared and ready. Miss Hartwell, come with me." He strode toward the main house without waiting to see if she followed. Lydia grabbed her traveling case and hurried after him, very aware of 3 pairs of eyes watching her progress across the yard. The house's interior matched its exterior, functional, sturdy, completely devoid of unnecessary decoration. The front door opened directly into a large room that served as both kitchen and living area. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty. A rough-hewn table with 6 mismatched chairs occupied the center of the space. Shelves held dishes, supplies, and a few books whose spines were too worn to read from a distance. Everything was clean but Spartan, the home of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and considered the house merely a place to sleep between work shifts. "Kitchen's there," Mercer said, gesturing unnecessarily at the obvious. "Stove works, though it's temperamental. You have to adjust the damper just right, or it'll smoke. Pantry's through that door reasonably well stocked. I do my own cooking, but I won't pretend I'm good at it. If you can make anything more complicated than beans and bacon, you'll be an improvement. He moved through a doorway into a narrow hall. Bedroom down here is mine. You'll take the upstairs room. It's smaller, but it has a window and a decent bed. Outhouse is behind the barn, about 50 yards. There's a washstand upstairs, but for bathing, you'll have to heat water on the stove and use the tub in the pantry. We do that on Saturdays, generally. Lydia followed him up a steep staircase to the second floor. The promised bedroom was indeed small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, but it had a real bed with a mattress that looked significantly more comfortable than the one at Fletcher's boarding house, a simple dresser, and a window that overlooked the valley. The view was spectacular, miles of grassland and sky with the mountains rising in the distance. "This is fine," Lydia said. "More than fine, actually." Mercer nodded. "Good. Get yourself settled, then come back downstairs. I'll show you where everything is, go over what I need from you." He paused at the door. "One more thing. The hands eat in the bunkhouse, take care of their own meals. You're not their cook or maid. You work for me, not them. They understand that." "Understood." "All right then. Take your time." He left, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Lydia was alone in her new room. She set her traveling case on the bed and went to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. 4 days ago, she'd been on a train, terrified but hopeful, traveling toward a future as Thomas Brennan's wife. 3 days ago, she'd stood on a train platform, alone and penniless, watching her dreams dissolve. Now she was here, in a rancher's house 15 miles from the nearest town, about to begin work she'd never done for a man she barely knew. It should have felt like defeat, a desperate compromise, a settling for less than she'd hoped for. Instead, standing at that window overlooking the high valley, Lydia felt something unexpected. Possibility. Downstairs, Wyatt Mercer was pulling account ledgers from a shelf, and when Lydia descended, he had them spread across the kitchen table in organized chaos. "These are 3 years of ranch records," he said without preamble. "Income, expenses, cattle sales, equipment purchases, payroll for the hands. I keep track of everything, but the system is—" He trailed off, frowning at the ledgers. "Well, it works for me, but I'll admit it's not elegant." Lydia sat down and opened the top ledger, immediately recognizing a familiar problem. Like Frank Patterson at the general store, Mercer had invented his own bookkeeping method, functional but inefficient, with information scattered across multiple books with no clear organizational principle. "How much time do you spend on these each week?" she asked. "Too much. 3-4 hours at least, usually late at night when I'm already exhausted. I can add and subtract well enough, but keeping everything straight." He shook his head. "I'd rather be working cattle." "I can fix this," Lydia said, her confidence growing as she flipped through pages, identifying patterns and problems. "It'll take me a few weeks to completely reorganize the system, but once it's in place, you'll spend maybe an hour a month on bookkeeping instead of hours every week." Mercer's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close. "That would be worth the $2 a week right there." "What else do you need from me? You mentioned cooking." 3 meals a day for me, breakfast and dinner, simple. I'm not particular. Lunch I usually take with me when I'm working the far pastures, so just pack something I can carry. The hands handle their own food in the bunkhouse, like I said, though if you end up making extra of something, they won't turn it down. He gestured around the kitchen. "Keep the house clean, do laundry once a week. Mend anything that needs mending. I've got a pile of shirts with buttons missing and tears that need patching. If you have time beyond that, there's always work that needs doing." It sounded manageable, even easy compared to the 14-hour shifts she'd worked at the textile mill. Lydia felt a surge of relief. She could do this. She could earn her place here. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. Breakfast at 5:30. I'm up and working by 6. Tonight, just get yourself settled, familiarize yourself with the kitchen and supplies. There's bread and some preserved meat in the pantry if you're hungry." He began gathering the ledgers. "I'll be in the barn until dark, checking on a mare that's about to foal. If you need anything, come find me. Otherwise, I'll see you in the morning." He left through the back door, and Lydia found herself alone in the house that was now, at least temporarily, her home. She spent the next hour exploring methodically. The pantry was surprisingly well stocked with flour, cornmeal, dried beans, preserved vegetables in jars, salt pork, and a few precious luxuries like coffee and sugar. The cooking stove was indeed temperamental. She built a small fire to test it and spent 20 minutes adjusting the damper until the smoke stopped pouring into the kitchen. There were pots, pans, basic utensils, and a surprisingly good set of knives. Upstairs, she unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her 2 dresses in the small closet, arranging her undergarments in the dresser, placing her mother's Bible on the nightstand beside the bed. The room felt empty with so little to fill it, but it was hers, and that was something. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, Lydia stood at the kitchen window and watched Wyatt Mercer move between the barn and corrals. Even from a distance, his competence was evident. The way he handled the horses, the efficiency of his movements, the quiet authority with which he directed Pete and the other hands. This was a man who'd built something real out of nothing, who'd taken 4,000 acres of raw prairie and turned it into a working ranch through sheer determination and skill. There was no pretense to him, no wasted energy on appearances or social niceties. He was exactly what he appeared to be, hard, fair, and completely focused on survival. Lydia found it oddly reassuring. There were no games to play here, no complex social hierarchies to navigate. Work hard, prove your worth, earn your place. It was brutally simple. And after years of navigating the complicated dynamics of poverty in Boston, she appreciated the clarity. She made herself a simple meal of bread and preserved ham, ate standing at the window, and watched darkness slowly claim the valley. Lights appeared in the bunkhouse windows. Mercer emerged from the barn one final time, paused to look toward the main house, then headed toward the bunkhouse, probably to brief his men on the next day's work. Lydia cleaned her plate, banked the fire in the stove, and climbed the stairs to her room. The bed was comfortable, the blankets heavy and warm, and through the window she could see more stars than she'd ever imagined existed, scattered across the black vault of the sky like diamonds spilled across velvet. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by travel and emotion and the sheer enormity of everything that had changed in the past 4 days. Morning came brutally early, announced by roosters and the sounds of men moving in the yard below. Lydia woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was, then memory flooded back and she bolted upright. 5:30 breakfast. She had no idea what time it was now, but pale light was already filtering through the window. She dressed frantically, splashed cold water on her face from the washstand, and hurried downstairs to find Mercer already in the kitchen, building up the fire in the stove. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "You're up. Good. I'm sorry, I should have been down earlier to start breakfast. You didn't know the routine yet, no harm done." He straightened, closing the stove's iron door. "Fire's going. I was going to make coffee, but since you're here, I'll leave that to you. I'll be outside seeing to the horses." He left, and Lydia took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She could do this. Coffee first. She found the grounds and the battered pot, measured water from the pump at the sink, set it on the stove. While it heated, she investigated the pantry. Eggs. They had chickens. She'd seen the coop yesterday. Bacon. Bread that was a few days old but still good for toasting. By the time Mercer returned 20 minutes later, she had coffee ready, bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan, and eggs cooking alongside. Toast sat on a plate, and she'd even found a jar of preserves. Mercer stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the table. "You can actually cook," he said, something like surprise in his voice. "I told you I could." People say a lot of things that turn out not to be true. He sat down, and Lydia served the food, then poured coffee for both of them. Mercer took a bite of bacon, then eggs, chewed thoughtfully. "This is good. Better than good, actually." "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence. Mercer finished quickly, clearly a man accustomed to viewing meals as fuel, and was already pushing back from the table when Lydia spoke. "What's the plan for today? What do you need from me?" "For you? Familiarize yourself with the house, start looking at those ledgers, make whatever you want for lunch and dinner. I'll be out riding the north fence line with Pete, won't be back until evening." He paused at the door. "You did well this morning, Miss Hartwell." It was a small compliment, delivered casually, but Lydia felt it like warmth spreading through her chest. The door closed behind him, and she was alone again. The first week passed in a blur of establishing routines and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Lydia woke at 5 each morning, had breakfast ready by 5:30, then spent the mornings reorganizing Mercer's account ledgers while bread rose or stew simmered. Afternoons were for cleaning, laundry, mending, the endless maintenance a house required. Evenings, she prepared dinner, which Mercer ate quickly before returning to whatever work demanded his attention. They spoke little beyond the practical necessities. Mercer would inform her of his schedule for the next day, whether he'd need packed lunch, if any supplies were running low. Lydia would confirm, maybe mention something that needed repair or replacement. The conversations were brief, efficient, entirely businesslike. But she was learning about him nonetheless, through observation and the small details people revealed without realizing. The way he checked the horses every morning before anything else, running his hands down their legs, examining their hooves with the careful attention of someone who understood that his livelihood depended on their health. The way he never raised his voice to the ranch hands, but when he gave an order, it was obeyed immediately, not from fear, but from respect. The way he sometimes stood on the porch at dusk, just watching the valley, and something in his expression would soften slightly, as though the land itself provided comfort that human company couldn't. He was a man utterly married to this place, Lydia realized. The High Valley wasn't just his business or his property. It was his purpose, his identity, the thing he'd built when the world had offered him nothing. She understood that completely because she was beginning to feel it herself. On Saturday of her first week, Mercer returned from town with news. "I spoke with Eleanor Patterson," he said over dinner, beef stew that had turned out better than Lydia had hoped. "Told her you were working here full-time now, that you wouldn't be able to keep doing her books." She was disappointed, but she understood. Lydia nodded. She'd wondered about that, had felt guilty about leaving Mrs. Patterson without help, but the math was simple. $2 a week plus room and board at the ranch was better than $1 a week in town while paying $3 for lodging. She also said to tell you that if you ever need anything, female things, she said, though she didn't specify what that meant, you should send word and she'll have it ready when I come to town. Mercer looked vaguely uncomfortable, clearly uncertain whether this message required further discussion. "That's very kind of her," Lydia said, sparing him. "Please thank her next time you see her." "Will do." He returned his attention to his stew, and Lydia hid a smile. For all his competence managing a 4,000-acre ranch, Wyatt Mercer was apparently defeated by the prospect of discussing women's necessities. The second week brought their first real conversation that wasn't purely functional. It happened on a Tuesday evening when Mercer came in from work to find Lydia at the kitchen table, surrounded by ledgers and papers, her face tight with concentration. "Problem?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Not exactly. I'm trying to understand your cattle sales from last year. You sold 200 head in October, received payment in November, but the amount seems low. I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly before I reorganize it." Mercer moved to stand beside her, looking down at the ledger. He smelled of horses and leather and the sharp cold of the evening air. "That's right. Prices were down last fall. Drought in the southern territories meant everyone was selling at once, flooded the market." He pointed to a notation in the margin. "That's why I held back an extra 50 head that I'd planned to sell. Figured I'd do better waiting for spring when prices recovered." "Did they recover?" "Somewhat. Sold them in March for 20% more than I'd have gotten in October. Still not what they were worth, but better." He pulled out a chair and sat down, studying the ledgers with an expression that suggested he was seeing them in a new light. "You've really torn through these, haven't you?" "I like numbers," Lydia said simply. "They make sense in a way people often don't. They're honest, they add up, or they don't. There's no ambiguity." "I know what you mean." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Thomas said something similar once. He said numbers were the one language that didn't lie." Thomas's name still brought a sharp pang of loss mixed with guilt. Loss for the life that might have been. Guilt that she was now living a different version of it with a different man. But Lydia was learning that grief was complicated, that she could mourn Thomas while also being grateful for Wyatt's unexpected kindness in offering her this position. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. Mercer's expression shifted, became more guarded. "No, grew up in Missouri, worked in my father's dry goods store. Hated every minute of it. The closed-in feeling, the endless inventory, the customers who'd argue for 20 minutes over a penny discount. He stared at the ledger without seeing it. When I was 21, my father died. My older brother inherited the store. I took my small portion of the inheritance, came west, and bought 800 acres of nothing. Best decision I ever made. Do you ever regret it? The isolation? The hard work? Every winter, he said frankly. When it's 20 below and the cattle are dying despite everything you do, when you're breaking ice on the water troughs at 4 in the morning and you can't feel your hands, when you realize you might lose everything to weather or disease or simple bad luck, yeah, in those moments, I wonder what the hell I was thinking. He looked at her directly. But then spring comes. The calves are born, the grass turns green, and you ride out across your own land under a sky so big it makes you feel like you could breathe for the first time in your life. And you remember why you're here. Lydia understood exactly what he meant. She'd felt it herself, standing at her bedroom window watching the sun rise over the valley, seeing the land wake up, and feeling like she was part of something larger than her own small survival. I think Thomas knew you'd understand, Mercer said quietly. That's why he sent for you. He was looking for someone who could see what he saw in this place. I wish I'd had the chance to meet him. So do I. He would have liked you. Mercer stood, the moment of openness clearly over. I'll let you get back to work. Dinner was good, by the way. The stew. Thank you. After he left, Lydia sat alone at the table, her hands resting on the ledgers, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a job anymore, wasn't just survival. She was beginning to belong here, to this place, to the rhythms of ranch life. And perhaps, though she barely dared think it, to the quiet, complicated man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. The third week brought the first real test of her capabilities. Mercer came in for breakfast looking grim. I need to ride out to the far pasture, he said. One of the hands spotted a section of fence down, probably elk pushing through during the night. It'll take all day to repair, maybe longer. I'll be taking Pete and Jack with me. What do you need from me? Danny's staying here to watch the near herds and handle anything that comes up. His shoulder's hurt, got thrown by a horse 2 days ago, so he can't do heavy work. I need you to help him however he needs. Lydia's stomach tightened with anxiety. Help him how? He'll tell you. Could be anything from hauling water to holding fence posts while he nails. Can you do that? She had no idea, but she heard herself say, yes. Good. Mercer drained his coffee and stood. We're leaving in 10 minutes. Danny knows you'll be available if he needs you. Don't let him push himself too hard. That shoulder needs rest or it'll never heal right. An hour later, Lydia found herself in the barn with Danny Cooper, a lanky 19-year-old with red hair and a sling supporting his left arm. He looked almost as nervous as she felt. Ma'am, I don't want to impose, he said, but there's some feed sacks that need moving from the storage shed to the barn, and with this shoulder, show me what needs doing. The feed sacks weighed at least 50 pounds each. Lydia had never lifted anything that heavy in her life, had no idea how to even begin. But Danny showed her how to squat and lift with her legs, how to balance the weight against her shoulder, how to walk without throwing her back out. It took her an hour to move 20 sacks, and by the end she was sweating despite the cold, her muscles screaming in protest. But she did it, and when Danny thanked her with genuine appreciation, she felt a surge of pride completely disproportionate to the task. The rest of the day brought more challenges. A water trough had cracked and needed to be patched with tar. The chicken coop needed cleaning. One of the horses had caught its leg on a fence nail and needed the wound cleaned and bandaged. Danny taught her patiently, never making her feel stupid for not knowing things that were obvious to anyone who'd grown up on a ranch. And Lydia learned, quickly, desperately, committing everything to memory, because she understood that her value here depended on her ability to be useful. When Mercer returned at dusk, exhausted and covered in dirt, he found Lydia at the barn checking on the injured horse while Danny secured the other animals for the night. How did it go? Mercer asked. Fine, Lydia said, wiping her hands on her apron, now ruined, stained with tar and manure and other things she didn't want to identify. We got everything done. Danny appeared from a stall. She's a natural, boss, worked harder than half the hands I've seen, and she didn't complain once. Mercer's eyes met Lydia's, and she saw something new there, not just approval, but respect. Good work, he said simply. That night,
Her entire body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her hands were blistered, her back felt like it might never straighten again, and she was pretty sure she smelled like a combination of horse, tar, and chicken droppings. But as she soaked her blistered hands in cold water and looked out her bedroom window at the stars, Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine accomplishment. She'd earned her place here, not through manipulation or luck, but through honest work. And tomorrow, she'd do it again. The days blurred together after that, each one bringing new challenges and small victories. Lydia learned to read weather signs in the sky, to tell when a storm was coming hours before it arrived. She learned which horses were gentle and which ones required a firm hand. She learned to shoot, Mercer insisted, saying anyone living this far from town needed to be able to defend themselves. And though she was terrible at first, by the end of the month she could hit a target more often than not. She learned that Wyatt Mercer was a better man than he pretended to be. He was hard, yes, but never cruel. Demanding, but never unreasonable. And beneath the gruff exterior, she occasionally caught glimpses of humor, intelligence, even kindness. Like the morning she came downstairs to find a new cast-iron skillet sitting on the stove, heavier and better balanced than the old one that had been losing its coating. "Picked it up in town," Mercer said casually when she asked. "Figured you could use better equipment if you're going to keep cooking like you do." Or the evening she mentioned missing books, and 2 days later he returned from checking on a neighboring ranch with 3 novels borrowed from their collection. "Mrs. Henshaw said you could keep them as long as you need," he said, setting them on the table. She was glad to hear someone else out here actually reads. Small gestures offered without fanfare, but they mattered more than Lydia knew how to express. On the last Saturday of her trial month, Mercer made a trip to town and returned with her wages. $8, 4 weeks at $2 each, paid in actual bills that he counted out onto the kitchen table. "That's the month," he said. "You've more than earned it. Question is, what happens now?" Lydia looked at the money, then at Mercer. "I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." "I was hoping you'd say that." He pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. "Here's what I'm thinking. The trial's over and you've proven yourself 10 times over. I want to offer you a permanent position, same wages, same work, for as long as it suits us both." Relief flooded through her. "I accept." "There's more." Mercer's expression grew serious. "Winter's coming, and it's going to be hard. We'll be snowed in for weeks at a time, maybe months. The work gets harder, the days get darker, and the isolation gets to people. I've seen strong men break under it. I need to know you understand what you're signing up for." "I understand." "Do you?" He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "You'll be stuck here, 15 miles from town, with no other women to talk to, nothing but work and wind and cold. If you hate it, if you can't stand it, there's no leaving until the snow melts. You need to be sure, Lydia, absolutely sure." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his rough voice did something strange to her pulse. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "This is where I want to be." Mercer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. Welcome to the High Valley. Permanently." They shook hands across the table, his grip strong and calloused, and Lydia felt like she'd just crossed some invisible threshold into a future she couldn't quite see yet but desperately wanted to discover. Outside, the first real cold of autumn was settling over the valley, and in the distance, the mountains wore fresh snow like warnings of what was to come. But here, in the warm kitchen of the main house, Lydia Hartwell felt safer and more certain than she had in years. She'd found her place, and she had no intention of leaving it. Winter announced itself with a vengeance in mid-November, arriving not gradually but all at once, as though the season had been waiting impatiently and finally decided to make its entrance. Lydia woke one morning to find the world transformed, snow blanketing everything in white silence, the wind howling like something alive and furious, the temperature so cold that frost formed on the inside of her bedroom window. She dressed in layers, an extra petticoat beneath her wool dress, thick stockings, the heavy shawl Wyatt had wordlessly left on her chair 3 days earlier, when the first serious cold snap hit. Downstairs, she found him already awake, feeding split logs into the fireplace with methodical efficiency. "Storm came in faster than expected," he said without turning around. "We'll be snowed in for at least 3 days, maybe a week.
Pete and the boys are securing the cattle in the near pastures, bringing them closer to the barn where we can monitor them. Lydia moved to the kitchen window and looked out at what had been, just yesterday, a clear view of the valley. Now she could barely see 20 feet through the driving snow. The world had contracted to just the ranch buildings, everything beyond erased by white. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Keep the fires going, make sure we have enough wood brought inside before it gets worse. I'll be out with the hands most of the day." He finally looked at her, his expression grave. "This is what I warned you about. This is what winter means out here." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not afraid." Something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps, or relief. "Good, because it's going to get harder before it gets easier." He was right. The storm lasted 6 days, and during that time the High Valley became a prison of ice and wind. Wyatt and the ranch hands worked brutal hours, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed to cattle that couldn't reach grazing areas, checking constantly for animals that had wandered too far and gotten stuck in drifts. They came in only for brief meals, their faces raw and reddened, ice crusting their beards and eyebrows, exhaustion etched into every movement. Lydia kept the house warm, the coffee hot, and the food coming. She learned to cook for men who needed calories more than flavor, producing enormous pots of thick stew, batches of biscuits, fried potatoes with salt pork. She kept water heating on the stove so the men could thaw their frozen hands. She dried their wet clothes by the fire and had dry replacements ready. And late at night, when the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse and Wyatt finally came inside for the last time, she would find him standing by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression of such weariness that it hurt to see. "We lost 3 calves today," he said on the 4th night, his voice flat. "Froze to death before we could get to them. Another 2 are sick, probably won't make it through tomorrow." Lydia poured him coffee, added a measure of whiskey from the bottle she'd found in the pantry. "I'm sorry. It's the frontier. Animals die." He took the cup, wrapped his hands around it like the warmth was more valuable than the contents. "Doesn't make it easier." She wanted to offer comfort, but she'd learned that Wyatt didn't want empty platitudes. So instead she simply sat across from him, sharing the silence, letting him process the losses in his own way. "You should get some sleep," she said finally. "You've been up for 20 hours. So have you. I've been inside where it's warm. You've been out in that." She gestured toward the window where wind still rattled the glass. "You'll be no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." After he'd gone upstairs, Lydia remained by the fire, banking it for the night, making sure enough wood was stacked nearby for morning. Through the window, she could see a faint glow from the bunkhouse where the hands were probably doing the same thing, preparing for another brutal day, taking what rest they could. This was the reality of the frontier, she thought. Not the romantic vision of wide-open spaces and freedom, but this: endless work, constant vigilance, losses that came despite your best efforts, and the grim determination to keep going anyway. And somehow, impossibly, she was starting to love it. When the storm finally broke on the 7th day, the silence was almost shocking. Lydia woke to pale sunlight streaming through her window and the absence of wind. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Wyatt already outside surveying the damage. The snow was 3 feet deep in places, sculpted into strange shapes by the wind. Fences had disappeared beneath drifts. The path to the barn was completely buried, but the sky was clear, achingly blue, and the mountains in the distance gleamed white and magnificent. Pete appeared from the bunkhouse, followed by Jack and Danny, all of them moving with the stiff caution of men whose bodies had been pushed past reasonable limits. "We need to dig out," Wyatt was saying as Lydia stepped onto the porch. "Clear paths to the barn, the corrals, the feed storage. Check every section of fence we can reach. Mark anything that needs repair come spring. And we need to do a full count of the herd. I want to know exactly what we lost." The men nodded and dispersed to gather shovels. Wyatt noticed Lydia and walked over, his boots crunching in the snow. "Morning," he said. "Storm's over." "I can see that. How bad is the damage?" "Won't know until we assess everything, but it could have been worse. We'll spend today digging out, tomorrow counting losses." He paused, studying her face. "You held up well. Better than some men I've employed." The compliment was simple, but coming from Wyatt Mercer, it meant everything. "What can I do to help?" she asked. "Keep doing what you've been doing. We'll need food, hot drinks, a warm place to recover between shifts. That's more valuable than you know." But Lydia was restless with the need to contribute more substantially. After breakfast, she bundled herself in every warm garment she owned, wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, and ventured outside with a shovel. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She'd been outside briefly during the storm, but this was different. This was the deep, bone-penetrating cold that characterized high-altitude winters. For a moment, she considered retreating to the house. Then she saw Wyatt and Pete working to clear a path to the barn, their movement steady despite obvious exhaustion, and she forced herself forward. "Miss Hartwell, you don't need to," Pete started when he saw her. "I have 2 working hands and a functioning shovel," she interrupted. "Show me where you need help." Wyatt turned, surprise crossing his features, then something that might have been respect. "All right, start clearing the porch and the area around the house. We need emergency exits in case of fire." Shoveling snow was brutal work. Her muscles, already sore from days of heavy cooking and hauling wood, screamed in protest. Her hands blistered inside her gloves. Sweat formed on her back despite the freezing temperature, then chilled the moment she paused to rest. Her lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. But she kept working, driven by stubborn determination and the need to prove she belonged here, that she could handle whatever the frontier demanded. By midday, she'd cleared the porch and a path to the woodshed. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, her back felt permanently bent at the waist, and she was fairly certain she'd never be warm again. Danny appeared beside her, his shoulder apparently healed enough for light work. "Ma'am, you should rest. You're going to hurt yourself." "I'm fine." "With respect, you're not. You're swaying on your feet." His voice was kind but firm. "Boss would have my hide if I let you collapse out here." Lydia wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. Her vision swam slightly, and she realized Danny was right. She'd pushed too far. "All right," she conceded, "but I'm coming back out after I warm up." "Yes, ma'am." Inside, she made coffee with hands that could barely grip the pot, then sat by the fire and waited for feeling to return to her extremities. Her face was raw and wind-burned, her fingers ached, and every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers. She'd never felt more alive. That evening, after the men had finished the initial clearing work and retired to the bunkhouse, Wyatt came to the main house to find Lydia at the stove, preparing dinner despite her obvious exhaustion. "You overdid it today," he said, his tone somewhere between concern and exasperation. "I helped. You nearly gave yourself frostbite and exhaustion. That's not helping, that's being reckless." He moved closer, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression was openly frustrated. "You don't have anything to prove, Lydia. You've already shown you can handle this life. You don't need to kill yourself shoveling snow to earn your place here." "Maybe I wasn't doing it to prove anything to you," she said quietly. "Maybe I was proving it to myself." That stopped him. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" he asked finally. "That I'm not the same person who stepped off that train in Dry Creek 2 months ago. That woman was terrified and helpless and completely dependent on the kindness of strangers." Lydia set down the wooden spoon she'd been using, turned to face him fully. "I don't want to be her anymore. I want to be someone who can survive anything this land throws at me." Wyatt was quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened. "You already are that person. You became her the moment you agreed to come out here instead of giving up. The rest is just you learning what you're capable of." The words settled into Lydia's chest, warm and affirming in a way she hadn't expected. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "But," Wyatt continued, his tone returning to its usual practical firmness, "being capable doesn't mean being stupid. Tomorrow, you work inside. The hands and I will finish the outside clearing. Understood?" "Understood." "Good." He moved toward the stairs, then paused. "And Lydia? Thank you. For today, for the past 6 days, for all of it. I couldn't have managed without you." He was gone before she could respond, his boots heavy on the stairs, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen with her heart doing complicated things she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The days after the storm fell into a new rhythm, harder and more demanding than before, but also strangely satisfying. The ranch hands worked from before dawn until after dark, repairing storm damage, tending to sick or injured cattle, preparing for the next inevitable weather event. Lydia managed the house, the food, the endless domestic work that kept everyone fed and functional. But increasingly, she found herself in conversations with Wyatt that went beyond the merely practical. They would talk over late dinners after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the topics ranged widely. His plans for expanding the herd come spring, her observations about inefficiencies in the ranch operations that could be improved, books they'd both read, memories of their respective pasts. She learned that he'd lost his mother young, that his father had been a hard man who believed affection was weakness, that he'd come west not just for opportunity, but to escape the suffocating expectations of inheriting a business he despised, that he'd almost lost the ranch 3 times in the early years, once to drought, once to disease, once to a winter even worse than this one, and had survived each time through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. "Why didn't you marry?" she asked one evening, emboldened by the intimacy of firelight and the isolation that made honesty feel less dangerous. "You could have, surely. A successful rancher, land of your own. There must have been women interested." But Wyatt was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "I was married, briefly." Lydia's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "Her name was Catherine," he continued, staring into his coffee as though it held answers. "Daughter of a rancher from the next county over. We married when I was 26, right after I'd bought the first parcel of land. She was—" He paused, searching for words. "She was beautiful, educated, everything I thought I wanted, but she hated it here. Hated the isolation, the work, the endless dirt and animals, and lack of society. She lasted 8 months, then left for Denver and filed for divorce." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She was right to leave. I couldn't give her the life she wanted, and she couldn't pretend to want the life I was building. We were fundamentally incompatible." He looked up, met Lydia's eyes. "That was 7 years ago. Since then, I've been careful. The ranch demands everything I have. I won't offer that to someone who can't or won't understand it." Lydia understood perfectly what he wasn't saying, that he'd built walls, that he'd decided the ranch was safer to love than any person, that loneliness was preferable to the risk of another Catherine. "She must not have seen what you were building," Lydia said carefully. "The value of it. She saw dirt and isolation and hard work with no guarantee of success. She wasn't wrong. That's exactly what it was, still is most days." His expression was unreadable. "Why didn't you marry back east? You're intelligent, capable, attractive. There must have been men." Now it was Lydia's turn to feel exposed. "There was someone. A clerk at the textile mill, worked in the office. He courted me for 6 months, very properly. Then he proposed." "But you didn't accept." "I did, actually, for about 12 hours. She smiled without humor. "Then I realized he didn't want a wife. He wanted a housekeeper he could sleep with. He had very specific ideas about what my life would be. Cooking his meals, bearing his children, never working outside the home again, never having opinions about anything important. When I suggested I might continue working, at least until we'd saved enough for a better apartment, he told me no wife of his would embarrass him by working like a common laborer. So you ended it." "So I ended it. And after that, the other men who showed interest all wanted the same thing, someone decorative and subservient and completely without ambition." She looked at Wyatt directly. "When Thomas's letters arrived, offering partnership instead of possession, it felt like the first honest proposal I'd ever received. Understanding passed between them, unspoken but profound. They were both people who'd been offered lives that didn't fit, who'd taken enormous risks to find something that might, who'd chosen loneliness over the wrong kind of companionship." "Thomas would have been good to you," Wyatt said quietly. "I know, but I think—" Lydia hesitated, then pushed forward. "I think maybe I ended up where I was supposed to be anyway." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Wyatt's expression shifted, something warming in his eyes, and for a moment Lydia thought he might say something, might acknowledge the thing that was building between them. Instead, he stood abruptly. "I should check the horses one more time before bed. Storm might be over, but we're not done with winter yet." He left through the back door, and Lydia remained by the fire, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd said too much or not enough. December brought more snow and a cold that made the November storm seem mild by comparison. Temperatures plummeted so low that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to air. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam that hung in the still air. The ranch hands worked in shifts, no one staying outside for more than an hour at a time for fear of frostbite. And through it all, Lydia and Wyatt circled around each other like wary animals, drawn together by proximity and growing affection, but held apart by caution and uncertainty. Then came the night everything changed. It was mid-December, during a particularly brutal cold snap. Wyatt had been out checking the herd with Pete, making sure the animals weren't clustering too close to areas where snow might avalanche from the barn roof. They'd been gone for hours, far longer than such a check should have taken. Lydia tried to remain calm, tried to focus on the mending in her lap, but as the hours stretched past midnight with no sign of their return, fear began to gnaw at her. At 1:30 in the morning, the back door finally opened. Pete stumbled in first, supporting Wyatt, whose face was gray and whose left hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. "What happened?" Lydia was on her feet instantly, helping Pete guide Wyatt to a chair. "Bull got spooked, charged the fence," Pete said tersely. "Boss got between it and the brake, trying to turn it back. Caught his hand on barbed wire when he went down." Wyatt was shaking. From cold, pain, or shock, Lydia couldn't tell. His lips had a bluish tinge, and when she unwrapped the makeshift bandage, the gash across his palm was deep and still bleeding steadily. "Get him by the fire," she ordered Pete. "Then bring me the whiskey, clean cloths, and the medical kit from the pantry. Move." Pete obeyed without question, and Lydia knelt beside Wyatt's chair, carefully examining the wound. It was bad, would probably need stitches, but she thought it had missed the major tendons. Still, infection was a serious risk, especially out here, miles from any doctor. "This is going to hurt," she told Wyatt, meeting his eyes. He nodded, jaw clenched. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, and Wyatt made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath, though she could see the muscles in his jaw working. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. She pressed clean cloth against it, applying steady pressure. "I need to stitch this," she said. "Have you got thread and a needle in that kit?" "Should be," Wyatt managed through gritted teeth. "You know how to do stitches?" "I've mended enough clothing. Skin can't be that different." She tried to sound confident, though her hands were shaking. "Pete, I need you to hold the lamp close. And Wyatt, you're going to want to drink some of this whiskey before I start." 20 minutes later, with 6 crude but functional stitches holding the wound closed and a proper bandage wrapped around Wyatt's hand, Lydia finally allowed herself to breathe. Pete had retreated to the bunkhouse, and she and Wyatt were alone in the firelit kitchen. "You're going to have a scar," she said, cleaning blood from her own hands. "Won't be my first." His voice was rough with exhaustion and residual pain. "Thank you. You did good work, better than some doctors I've seen." "You're welcome, but Wyatt, you can't go out tomorrow. That hand needs at least 3 days of rest, preferably a week." "Can't afford to rest. The herd will be fine for a few days under Pete's management. You've trained him well." She sat down across from him, her expression firm. "If you go out there tomorrow and rip those stitches, if that wound gets infected because you wouldn't give it time to start healing, you could lose the hand. Or worse. Is that really worth it?" He stared at her and she stared right back, refusing to back down. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" he said finally. "Not a chance." Something that might have been a laugh escaped him. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met." "Good. Then we understand each other." The tension broke, and Wyatt shook his head, wincing when the movement jarred his injured hand. "All right, 3 days. But if anything happens with the herd, Pete will handle it, and I'll help however I can." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, wind rattling the windows. Wyatt looked utterly exhausted, his face drawn with pain, but he made no move to go upstairs to bed. "You should rest," Lydia said gently. "So should you. You've been up since before dawn." "I will. Once I'm sure you're settled." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. The honest answer would have been too revealing, too dangerous. But something about the hour, the intimacy of the moment, the way he was looking at her, made Lydia brave. Because somewhere along the way, she said carefully, this stopped being just a job. This ranch, this life, it matters to me. All of it matters. Wyatt was very still. Lydia, you don't have to say anything, she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what might come next. I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know. She stood quickly, intending to retreat to her room, to safety, but Wyatt's good hand caught her wrist, stopping her. Wait, he said. Please. She waited, her pulse hammering. When you first arrived, Wyatt said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, I hired you because I felt responsible. Thomas had sent for you and he was gone, and it seemed wrong to leave you stranded. That was all it was. Responsibility, maybe guilt. Well, Lydia's heart was sinking, but she forced herself to listen. But then you stayed, he continued, and you worked harder than anyone I've ever employed. You learned everything I threw at you, never complained, never asked for special treatment. You made this house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between work shifts. And somewhere in all of that, you became, he paused, seeming to struggle, you became essential, not just to the ranch, but to me. Hope, dangerous and bright, flared in Lydia's chest. I told myself I wouldn't do this again, Wyatt said. Wouldn't let myself care about someone who might leave, who might decide this life isn't enough. But you're not Catherine. You're not anyone but yourself, and you've proven every day that you belong here. His grip on her wrist tightened slightly. So I'm asking, are you planning to stay? Really stay, not just until something better comes along? There is nothing better, Lydia said firmly. This is where I want to be. Where I choose to be. Something in Wyatt's expression cracked open, letting through a vulnerability she'd never seen before. Then I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I'm not good at this, at saying what I feel. Just say it. I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words rough and unpracticed but devastatingly sincere. Maybe have been for a while now. And I know the timing's wrong. No, we should probably wait, be proper about it, but I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of pretending this is just an employment arrangement when we both know it's become something else. Lydia's throat was tight with emotion. What are you asking me, Wyatt? I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. Not because you need security or I need a housekeeper, but because we're better together than apart. Because this ranch could be ours instead of just mine. Because I want to build something with you that's bigger than either of us alone. It was nothing like the proposal she'd imagined receiving from Thomas Brennan. No careful courtship, no gradual progression of affection. It was raw and sudden and completely honest, offered by a man who'd spent years protecting himself and was now choosing to be vulnerable. And it was exactly right. Yes, Lydia said, her voice breaking slightly. Yes, I'll marry you. Wyatt stood, carefully because of his injured hand, and pulled her close with his good arm. When he kissed her, it was gentle and fierce all at once, tasting of whiskey and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully comprehend. When they finally pulled apart, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. We'll have to wait until we can get to town for the circuit preacher, he said. Might be weeks, depending on the snow. I can wait, Lydia said. I've gotten good at patience. He smiled, a real smile, rare and transformative, making him look years younger. We should probably tell the hands in the morning, before they hear us talking and get the wrong idea. Or the right idea. Fair point. He kissed her again briefly. You realize you're agreeing to spend the rest of your life on this ranch, right? Winters like this, hard work, isolation, all of it. I know exactly what I'm agreeing to, Lydia said. And I want all of it. The hard winters, the endless work, the isolation, and you. Especially you. They stood together in the firelit kitchen, holding each other carefully because of Wyatt's injured hand, and outside the wind howled its approval, while inside 2 people who'd both been lost found themselves finally, impossibly, home. Morning came with the ranch hands' reactions ranging from surprise to quiet satisfaction, as though they'd been waiting for exactly this development. Pete shook Wyatt's good hand carefully and told Lydia she was getting a stubborn fool, but a decent one. which seemed to be the highest compliment he could offer. Danny grinned so wide his face looked like it might split, and Jack simply nodded with the solemn approval of someone who'd seen this coming from miles away. "About damn time, boss," Pete said over breakfast, his weathered face creasing into something approaching a smile. "Been watching you two circle each other like nervous colts for weeks now. Figured one of you would eventually work up the courage." Wyatt shot him a look that would have intimidated a lesser man, but Pete just laughed and reached for more coffee. The days that followed were strange and wonderful, filled with the ordinary work of the ranch, but transformed by the knowledge that everything had changed. Wyatt was careful with his injured hand, grudgingly following Lydia's orders to rest it, and she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart do complicated things. They were engaged now, promised to each other, but the formality of marriage would have to wait until the snow cleared enough for them to reach town and the circuit preacher. "Could be February before we can make the trip," Wyatt said one evening, standing beside her at the kitchen window as they watched fresh snow fall. His good arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her close in a way that still felt new and thrilling. "Maybe even March, if this winter keeps up the way it's going." "Then we'll wait until February or March," Lydia said simply. "The waiting doesn't change anything real between us." He kissed the top of her head, and she leaned into him, marveling at how natural this felt, how right. She traveled west to marry a stranger and ended up finding something far more valuable, a true partner, someone who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength instead of trying to diminish it. But winter had more trials in store for them before spring could arrive. 3 days before Christmas, a blizzard hit that made the previous storms look like gentle flurries. The wind screamed across the valley with such force that it seemed determined to tear the buildings from their foundations. Snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to zero, and the temperature plummeted to depths that made breathing painful. The ranch hands moved the most vulnerable cattle into the barn, packed tight but at least protected from the worst of the weather. Wyatt, his hand still healing but functional enough for emergency work, helped Pete secure every door and window, reinforce anything that might blow away, and prepare for what everyone knew would be a brutal siege. "This is bad," Pete said bluntly when they gathered in the main house for a final briefing before hunkering down. "Worst storm I've seen in 15 years out here. We're going to lose animals, no way around it. Question is how many and whether we can keep the rest alive." "We work in shifts," Wyatt said, his voice carrying the authority that made men listen even when they were scared. 2 hours outside maximum, then rotate back to warm up. Nobody plays hero, nobody takes stupid risks. The cattle that are in the barn stay in the barn. The ones that aren't. We do what we can, but we don't die trying to save them. Understood?" Everyone nodded, even Danny, who tended toward recklessness. "Lydia," Wyatt turned to her, "you keep the fires going, hot food ready, warm water available. If anyone shows signs of frostbite or hypothermia, you handle it. You're the base. We depend on you to keep things functional here." "I understand," she said, though fear was coiling in her stomach. The storm outside sounded like the end of the world, and she was being asked to be the anchor that kept everyone from being swept away. The next 48 hours blurred into an endless cycle of men stumbling in from the cold, their faces raw and ice-crusted, drinking scalding coffee and eating whatever food Lydia pressed into their hands before heading back out into the maelstrom. She learned to recognize the stages of cold, the violent shivering that meant someone could still recover, the dangerous stillness that meant they were past that point and needed immediate intervention. She treated Danny for frostbite on his ears, warming them slowly with lukewarm water while he gritted his teeth against the pain. She helped Jack thaw his frozen gloves from his hands when he came in unable to move his fingers. She wrapped heated stones in cloth and made the men hold them while they recovered, forced them to drink even when they insisted they were fine, and refused to let anyone go back outside until their core temperature had stabilized. And she waited, heart in her throat, every time Wyatt disappeared into the white hell beyond the door. On the second night of the storm, he came in looking worse than she'd ever seen him. His face was gray beneath the windburn, his movement slow and uncoordinated, and when she touched his hand, it was like ice. "How long were you out there?" she demanded, already pulling him toward the fire. "Don't know," he mumbled, his words slightly slurred. "Had to get the water trough cleared. Ice was building up. Cattle couldn't drink." You were out there too long, way too long. She was stripping off his frozen coat, his gloves, working quickly because she recognized the signs. He was hypothermic, not dangerously so yet, but close. Pete, I need blankets and hot water bottles. Pete materialized from somewhere, taking in the situation with one experienced glance. Jack, Danny, get the bath ready. Lukewarm water, not hot. Boss needs to warm up slowly. Between the three of them, they got Wyatt into the small room off the pantry where the bathtub sat, got him into water that was barely above body temperature, and began the slow process of bringing his core temperature back up. Lydia knelt beside the tub, monitoring him constantly, watching his color, checking his pulse, terrified in a way she'd never been before. I'm all right, Wyatt kept insisting through chattering teeth. Been colder than this before. Stop talking and let us take care of you, Lydia snapped, fear making her sharp. You could have died out there. Do you understand that? You could have frozen to death trying to clear a water trough. Cattle needed water. The cattle need you alive more than they need one water trough cleared right this second. Her hands were shaking as she added slightly warmer water to the bath, carefully monitoring the temperature. You're no good to anyone dead, Wyatt Mercer. Not to the ranch, not to the hands, and certainly not to me. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and seemed to finally understand how frightened she was. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're right. I stayed out too long. You did. She blinked back tears that were equal parts fear and anger and relief. Don't do it again. Yes, ma'am. An hour later, wrapped in blankets and sitting by the fire with hot coffee in his hands, Wyatt was recovering. The shivering had stopped, his color was better, and his coordination was back to normal. Pete had taken over outside duties, insisting the boss stay inside until morning, and for once, Wyatt didn't argue. You scared me, Lydia said when they were alone, the ranch hands having retreated to catch what sleep they could before their next shift. I scared myself, Wyatt admitted. I was out there clearing ice, and everything was fine, and then suddenly I couldn't feel my hands anymore. Couldn't remember why I was there or what I was supposed to be doing. That's when I knew I was in trouble. What made you come back? He smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. You did. I kept thinking about you waiting here, about how you'd be furious if I got myself killed doing something stupid, and I realized I didn't want to die out there. Not when I finally had someone, worth coming home to. Lydia moved closer to him on the settee they'd dragged near the fireplace. I need you to promise me something. What? That you won't take unnecessary risks, that you'll remember you're not alone anymore, that what happens to you matters to someone else now. She took his hand, careful of the healing wound on his palm. I know the ranch comes first for you. I understand that. I even respect it. But you have to survive to run the ranch. So promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Wyatt said, and she believed him. Though I have to say, having someone care whether I live or die, that's going to take some getting used to. You'll adjust, she said, leaning against his shoulder. I'll make sure of it. They sat together in the firelight, listening to the storm rage outside, and Lydia thought about how much had changed since that day in Dry Creek, when she'd stepped off the train with nowhere to go. She'd been so lost then, so certain her life was over. Now, sitting beside the man she loved in a house they'd soon share as husband and wife, she understood that sometimes the best things came from the worst disasters, that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what you were really looking for. The storm finally broke on the third day, revealing a landscape transformed. Snow lay in drifts taller than a man in some places, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The temperature remained brutally cold, but at least the wind had died and visibility had returned. The damage assessment was sobering. They'd lost 43 head of cattle, frozen to death or buried in snowdrifts. 2 sections of fence had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. The chicken coop had partially caved in, though the birds had somehow survived, and the ranch's stores of hay and feed had been depleted to dangerous levels, with months of winter still ahead. Could have been worse, Pete said, as they stood surveying the frozen carcasses of cattle they'd need to deal with once the ground thawed enough to dig. Could have been a lot worse. Doesn't feel like it, Wyatt said grimly. 43 head is nearly $3,000 in lost revenue, and we're going to have to buy feed to make it through to spring, which means more debt. Lydia, standing beside him with a shawl wrapped tight against the cold, watched the calculations play across his face. She'd been learning the economics of ranching, and she understood what this meant. A serious financial blow that would take years to recover from, assuming they could recover at all. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "We've survived worse." "Have we?" Wyatt's voice was bleak in a way she'd never heard before. "I've been building this ranch for 12 years, Lydia. 12 years of brutal work, of barely scraping by, of sacrificing everything to make it succeed. And one storm can wipe out years of progress in 3 days." "But it didn't wipe it out," she insisted. "We still have over 1,400 head alive. We still have the land, the buildings, the horses. We still have each other and the hands who know this operation inside and out. One bad storm doesn't erase everything you've built." He looked at her, and slowly the bleakness in his expression began to fade. "When did you get so optimistic?" "When I decided to stop seeing disasters as endings and start seeing them as challenges to overcome." She took his hand, squeezing it through their gloves. "We'll buy the feed we need, we'll repair the fences, and we'll rebuild the herd. It'll take time and work, but that's what we do here. We work, and we survive, and we keep going." Pete, who'd been tactfully pretending not to listen, cleared his throat. "Miss Hartwell's right, boss. Storm was bad, but we'll recover. Always do." Wyatt nodded slowly, and Lydia could see him deliberately pushing past the despair, choosing to focus on solutions instead of problems. It was one of the things she admired most about him, his ability to face brutal realities without flinching, to acknowledge the difficulty, and then immediately start figuring out how to overcome it. "All right," he said, his voice steadying. "Here's what we do. Pete, you and Jack start clearing the main paths so we can move supplies. Danny, check every building for storm damage and make a list of repairs needed. I'll assess the feed situation and figure out what we need to order from town." "And me?" Lydia asked. "You keep us all fed and functional while we dig out of this mess." He managed a small smile. "And remind me, when I start to despair, that we're going to make it through this." "Always," she promised. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. They were too exhausted from storm recovery to do more than acknowledge the day. But Lydia made a special dinner with precious supplies they'd been hoarding, and they gathered in the main house, Wyatt, Lydia, and the 3 ranch hands, and shared a meal that felt more like family than employment. To surviving another winter, Pete raised his coffee cup in a toast. And to the boss finally finding someone stubborn enough to put up with him. "Hear, hear!" Jack and Danny chorused, grinning. Wyatt shook his head but smiled, raising his own cup. "To finding exactly what I didn't know I was looking for." His eyes met Lydia's across the table, and the warmth in them made her forget, temporarily, the cold and the work and the losses they'd suffered. January brought more snow, but no storms of the magnitude they'd already survived. The daily work continued, feeding cattle, breaking ice, repairing damage, counting and recounting their dwindling supplies. Wyatt made a trip to town during a brief break in the weather, bringing back news and provisions. "Talk to the bank," he told Lydia that evening, and his expression was troubled. "They'll extend our credit for feed purchases, but the terms aren't good. High interest, short repayment window. If we have another bad year, we could lose everything." "Then we won't have another bad year," Lydia said with more confidence than she felt. "And even if we do, we'll find a way through it. We always do." He pulled a small package from his coat pocket. "I got you something. It's not much, but inside was a simple gold ring, sized for a woman's finger. Not fancy, not expensive, but solid and real." "I know we can't have the ceremony yet," Wyatt said, suddenly looking uncertain in a way that made Lydia's heart ache. "But I wanted you to have this, so you know it's real, that I'm serious about this, about us." Lydia took the ring with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly on her left hand, catching the firelight, transforming from simple gold to something precious. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." He kissed her then, gently at first and then with increasing intensity, and when they pulled apart, they were both breathless. "Soon as the pass clears," Wyatt promised, "we're going to town and making this official. I don't care if we have to dig through 10-foot snowdrifts to get there. I'll hold you to that." February arrived with the slow promise of change. The days grew incrementally longer, the cold marginally less brutal. The cattle began moving more freely, confident that survival was becoming more likely than death. And in the main house of the High Valley Ranch, two people who'd found each other against all odds began making plans for a future they'd build together. Then, on a clear morning in late February, when the snow had finally melted enough to make the trip feasible, Wyatt made an announcement at breakfast. "We're going to town today," he said. "All of us. Pete, you're in charge of supplies. Make a list of everything we need and get the best prices you can negotiate. Jack, Danny, you help him load and secure everything. And Lydia and I," he reached across the table and took her hand, "are going to find Reverend Blackwood and get married." The ranch hands erupted in congratulations and good-natured ribbing. Pete insisted on breaking out the bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted the coming wedding with coffee heavily fortified with alcohol. The journey to Dry Creek took nearly 4 hours over roads that were mud-slicked and treacherous, the wagon lurching through ruts and over rocks. But Lydia barely noticed the discomfort. She was too focused on what waited at the end of the trip. A wedding, a formal recognition of what had already become true in every way that mattered. Dry Creek looked different than it had when she'd arrived 5 months earlier. Or perhaps she was different, and that changed how she saw the town. It was still rough and dusty and barely civilized, but now it felt familiar rather than foreign, and when people recognized Wyatt's wagon and called out greetings, Lydia felt included in those greetings instead of isolated by them. They went first to Patterson's General Merchandise, where Eleanor Patterson took one look at Lydia's ring and let out a shriek of delight that brought her husband running from the back room. "I knew it," Eleanor declared, pulling Lydia into a fierce hug. "I told Frank, didn't I? I said those two were meant for each other, and I was right." "You were right," Lydia agreed, laughing. "Is Reverend Blackwood in town?" "He is. Arrived yesterday for his monthly circuit. He's staying at the boarding house. You go find him right now and tell him he's got a wedding to perform." Eleanor beamed at both of them. "This is wonderful news. Absolutely wonderful." They found Reverend Blackwood reading on the porch of Fletcher's boarding house, and he looked up at their approach with a knowing smile. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Hartwell," he greeted them. "I had a feeling I might be seeing you two today." "We'd like to get married," Wyatt said directly. "Today, if possible." "Today is very possible," the Reverend replied. "In fact, I'd be honored. Shall we say 2 o'clock at the church? That gives you time to gather any witnesses you'd like present and allows me to prepare." 2 o'clock. In just a few hours, Lydia would be married. The reality of it hit her all at once, and she felt momentarily dizzy. Wyatt's hand found hers, steadying her. 2 o'clock is perfect. They walked together through town, and Lydia was struck by how different this was from what she'd imagined her wedding day would be. No elaborate dress, no flowers, no carefully planned ceremony. Just two people who loved each other, making a promise in front of witnesses, starting a life together in the simplest and most honest way possible. Annie Caldwell found them near the general store and squealed with delight when she heard the news. "A wedding! You're getting married! Lydia, this is perfect! I'm so happy for you!" She grabbed Lydia's hands, examining the ring with approval. "You have to let me help you get ready. Come to my room at the boarding house. I have a dress that will fit you, and we can fix your hair properly." "Annie, you don't have to I absolutely do. You're getting married, and you're going to look beautiful doing it." Annie was already pulling her toward the boarding house. "Wyatt, you go find something to do for the next 2 hours. You can't see the bride before the ceremony." Wyatt looked amused and bemused in equal measure. "Yes, ma'am." In Annie's small room at Fletcher's boarding house, the same building where Lydia had spent her first desperate nights in Dry Creek, her friend worked with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. The dress was a deep blue silk, finer than anything Lydia had ever worn, and Annie altered it with quick, expert stitches to fit Lydia's frame. "There," Annie said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now, the hair." She pinned Lydia's auburn hair up in a style that was elegant but practical, wove in some winter greenery she'd somehow procured, and stepped back with satisfaction. "Look at yourself," she commanded, turning Lydia toward the small mirror. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable, not because of the dress or the hair, but because of the expression on her face. Confident, happy, certain.
This was not the desperate woman who'd arrived in Dry Creek with $4 and no prospects.
This was someone who'd survived, who'd worked, who'd proven herself worthy of the life she was about to claim.
I look like I belong here, Lydia said wonderingly. You do belong here, Annie said firmly. You always did. You just had to find your way to it. At 10 minutes to 2, they walked together to the small white church at the end of Dry Creek's main street. A small crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast in the way of small towns, and people who barely knew Lydia or Wyatt had come to witness the wedding. She saw Eleanor and Frank Patterson, Mrs. Fletcher looking almost approving, Ned Parsons from the station, and various townspeople whose names she didn't know, but whose faces had become familiar. And standing at the front of the church, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and what must have been his only tie, was Wyatt Mercer. When he turned and saw Lydia in Annie's blue dress, with winter greenery in her hair, his expression transformed into something so tender and amazed that she had to blink back tears. Pete, Jack, and Danny stood beside him, cleaned up and grinning, clearly taking their roles as witnesses seriously. The church was simple, plain wooden pews and a small altar, but to Lydia it was perfect. Reverend Blackwood stood at the altar, his Bible open, and he smiled warmly as Lydia joined Wyatt at the front of the church. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Wyatt Mercer and Lydia Hartwell in marriage." The ceremony was simple and brief, the words traditional, but when Wyatt spoke his vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish, his voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving Lydia's face. And when it was her turn, Lydia's voice was equally firm. "I, Lydia Hartwell, take you, Wyatt Mercer, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to work with you in building our life together, to be your partner in all things, from this day forward, for all my days." The Reverend smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Wyatt, you may kiss your bride." Wyatt pulled her close and kissed her in front of the assembled witnesses, and Lydia heard Annie's delighted laughter and Pete's gruff, "About time," and the general murmur of approval from the crowd. When they pulled apart, Wyatt whispered, "Hello, Mrs. Mercer." "Hello, Mr. Mercer," she replied, and they were both grinning like fools. The celebration afterward was impromptu but heartfelt. Someone produced a bottle of actual champagne, a shocking luxury in Dry Creek, and everyone toasted the newlyweds. Eleanor Patterson had somehow prepared a small wedding cake, which she presented with tears in her eyes. Even Mrs. Fletcher offered stiff congratulations and a gift of fine linen napkins she'd embroidered herself. "You did well, girl," she told Lydia quietly. "Better than I expected when you showed up here with nothing." "Thank you," Lydia said, and meant it. "For giving me those 3 days. I wouldn't be here without that kindness." "Kindness nothing. I saw you had spine and sense. Figured you'd land on your feet." Mrs. Fletcher almost smiled. "I'm rarely wrong about people." As the afternoon wore on and they needed to begin the journey back to the ranch before dark, the newlyweds said their goodbyes. Annie hugged Lydia so tight she could barely breathe. "Be happy," Annie whispered. "You deserve this." "I will be. Come visit when spring arrives. I want you to see the ranch." "I will. I promise." The ride back to the High Valley was quieter than the ride in, everyone tired from the celebration and the early morning start. But in the wagon bed, with supply boxes around them and the ranch hands dozing, Wyatt and Lydia sat close together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "Happier than I've ever been," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" "I didn't think I could be this happy. Didn't think I deserved it." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on me in this life. Thank you for offering me that chance in the first place, for seeing what I could be instead of just what I was." They rode in comfortable silence after that, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. When the High Valley Ranch came into view, Wyatt pointed to the main house. "That's our home now," he said. "Yours and mine together. Everything I've built, everything I own, it's ours to share." Lydia looked at the sturdy house, the barn and outbuildings, the vast expanse of land stretching in all directions, and felt a surge of belonging so powerful it took her breath away. This was hers now, not just by virtue of work or employment, but by right of partnership and love. She was no longer Lydia Hartwell, the desperate mail-order bride who'd arrived too late. She was Lydia Mercer, co-owner of the High Valley Ranch, wife to a good man, builder of a future that was still being written. And as they pulled into the ranch yard and the ranch hands began unloading supplies with cheerful efficiency, as Wyatt helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the house they'd now share as husband and wife, Lydia understood with perfect clarity that she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for all along. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just security, but partnership. Not just a place to live, but a home worth fighting for.
The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainty and hard work. But they would face it together, two people who'd both been lost and had somehow found each other in the vast emptiness of the frontier. And that, Lydia thought as Wyatt carried her across the threshold of their home while the ranch hands cheered and whistled, was worth every risk she'd taken to get here. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as though testing whether winter had truly relinquished its grip on the High Valley. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green, and the ice on the creek broke apart with sounds like rifle shots echoing across the valley. The cattle, lean from the hard winter but alive, began to spread out across the pastures again, and the ranch settled into the rhythm of renewal. Lydia woke on a morning in late March to find Wyatt already dressed, standing at the bedroom window and staring out at the land with an expression she'd learned to recognize. He was calculating, planning, measuring possibilities against resources. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up and pulling the quilt around her shoulders against the lingering chill. "Nothing's wrong, just thinking." He turned to her, and his expression was complicated, troubled but also determined. "The Standing Rock went up for auction yesterday. Pete heard about it in town last week. Thomas Brennan's ranch, the place Lydia had been meant to call home, the life that had been taken from her before it could begin. She'd almost forgotten about it in the months since, too consumed with building her actual life to mourn the one she'd lost. "Who bought it?" she asked. "Nobody yet. The auction was canceled. Not enough bidders showed up, and the minimum price wasn't met. The territorial court is going to try again in 2 months." Wyatt crossed to the bed, sat down beside her. "Lydia, I've been thinking about making an offer, a private offer, before the next auction." Her breath caught. "You want to buy the Standing Rock?" "I want us to buy it, together." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "It's 2,300 acres that border our land. The creek that runs through our property starts on Thomas's land. If someone else buys it, they could divert water or fence us off from the source. We'd be vulnerable." Lydia understood immediately. Water rights were everything out here, the difference between a thriving ranch and a failed one. Controlling the creek's source would secure their future in ways nothing else could. "But we don't have the money," she said carefully. "Not after the winter losses and the feed we had to buy. We're still carrying debt." "I know, but if we can convince the court to accept payments over time, if we can structure it right, we might be able to swing it." Wyatt's voice was intense, passionate in a way she rarely heard. "This is our chance, Lydia. The Standing Rock and the High Valley together. We'd have nearly 6,500 acres. We could run 3,000 head of cattle, maybe more. We'd be one of the largest operations in the territory." The ambition in his voice was intoxicating, but Lydia forced herself to think practically. "And if we can't make the payments? If we have another bad year?" "Then we lose everything," Wyatt admitted. "The Standing Rock, the High Valley, all of it. It's a massive risk." They sat in silence, the weight of the decision hanging between them. This wasn't just about money or land. It was about vision, about what they believed they could build together, about whether they had the courage to bet everything on a future they couldn't guarantee. "What does your gut tell you?" Lydia asked finally. Wyatt looked at her, and she saw both fear and hope in his eyes. That this is our moment, that if we don't take this chance, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been. He squeezed her hand. "But I won't do it without you. We're partners now. This decision is ours to make together." Lydia thought about the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that train in Dry Creek, frightened, desperate, willing to marry a stranger just to survive. And she thought about who she was now, Wyatt's wife, co-owner of a working ranch, Someone who'd proven she could handle whatever the frontier demanded. She'd spent her whole life playing it safe, making small choices, trying to minimize risk. And where had it gotten her? To a textile mill in Boston, slowly dying by inches, with no future worth claiming. Coming west had been the greatest risk she'd ever taken. Marrying Wyatt had been another, and every single risk had paid off in ways she never could have imagined. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "Let's buy the Standing Rock." Wyatt's face transformed, relief and excitement chasing away the tension. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. We'll make it work, we always do." He pulled her into a kiss that was celebratory and passionate and full of promise. And when they finally pulled apart, they were both grinning like conspirators planning a magnificent heist. The negotiations with the territorial court took 6 weeks of back and forth, complicated by the distance to the county seat and the slow pace of legal proceedings. Wyatt made 3 trips, each one lasting several days, while Lydia managed the ranch with Pete's assistance and waited anxiously for news. Finally, in early May, Wyatt returned with a contract and an expression of cautious triumph. "We got it," he said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. $1,500, paid over 5 years at 6% interest. First payment due in 6 months, after we've had time to sell this year's calves. Lydia studied the numbers, her bookkeeper's mind automatically calculating the implications. It was tight, very tight, with almost no margin for error. 1 bad year, 1 major loss, and they'd be unable to make the payments. "We can do this," she said, more to convince herself than him. The combined herd should produce enough calves to cover the payments, assuming decent prices and no catastrophic losses. "That's a lot of assumptions," Wyatt said. "Yes, but we've survived worse odds before." He signed the contract with a steady hand, and Lydia signed below him. Lydia Mercer, her new name still looking strange and wonderful on paper. They were now the owners of nearly 6,500 acres of prime grazing land, a debt that would take 5 years to pay off, and a future that suddenly seemed both terrifyingly uncertain and magnificently possible. The work of combining the 2 ranches began immediately. Wyatt hired 2 additional hands, experienced cowboys who came with solid references and strong backs. Pete was promoted to foreman of the entire operation, with a raise in pay that he accepted with gruff appreciation. Jack and Danny took on more responsibility, managing the day-to-day operations of the Standing Rock, while Wyatt and Pete coordinated between both properties, and Lydia found herself managing not just one household, but 2 ranches' worth of accounts, supplies, and logistics. The work was enormous, often overwhelming, but she threw herself into it with fierce determination. She rode out to the Standing Rock with Wyatt on a bright morning in late May, seeing for the first time the place Thomas Brennan had built. The house was smaller than the High Valley's main house, but sturdy and well-constructed, with the same attention to quality that had characterized Thomas's letters. The land rolled away in gentle hills, lush with spring grass, and the creek ran clear and cold through the center of the property. "This is where you would have lived," Wyatt said quietly, standing beside her as they surveyed the valley. "If Thomas had lived. If everything had gone according to plan." "I know." Lydia felt a complicated swirl of emotions, sadness for Thomas, gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to Wyatt instead, wonder at how different her life might have been. "Do you ever think about how many small things had to go wrong for us to end up together?" "All the time. Thomas dying one day before you arrived, you being stranded in town exactly when I was there, me feeling responsible enough to offer you work." Wyatt pulled her close. "Sometimes I wonder if it was all random chance or something else." "Does it matter?" Lydia asked. "We're here now, that's what counts." They stood together overlooking the Standing Rock, and Lydia felt Thomas Brennan's presence somehow, not ghostly or supernatural, but simply the echo of a good man's work, his hope for the future, his belief that this land was worth building on. "I think he'd approve," she said softly. "Of us, of what we're doing here. I think he'd be glad his ranch went to people who'll care for it the way he did." "I hope so," Wyatt said. "I'd like to think we're honoring his memory by making this work." The summer brought its own challenges and triumphs. The combined herds needed constant management, and there were days when Wyatt and Pete were in the saddle from before dawn until after dark, riding fence lines, checking water sources, moving cattle between pastures. The new hands proved their worth, and slowly, the operation began to function as a unified whole rather than two separate ranches. Lydia divided her time between both properties, sometimes staying at the Standing Rock for days at a time to manage the accounts and oversee the supplies, other times at the High Valley coordinating with the hands and preparing for the fall cattle sale that would determine whether they could make their first payment. And late at night, when she and Wyatt were finally alone, they would lie in bed and talk about the future they were building, the children they hoped to have someday, the school they might establish for ranch families in the area, the legacy they were creating through sweat and determination and stubborn refusal to quit. "I want our kids to grow up knowing they're part of something bigger than themselves," Wyatt said one night, his hand resting on Lydia's still flat stomach with gentle hope. "I want them to understand what it takes to build something real, something that lasts." "They will," Lydia promised. "We'll teach them, together." In July, Lydia discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually. A missed monthly cycle, morning nausea, an unusual fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. When she finally allowed herself to believe it, the joy was so intense it was almost frightening. She told Wyatt over dinner on a quiet evening when the hands were all at the bunkhouse and they had the main house to themselves. She'd planned something elaborate, some perfect way to share the news, but in the moment, she simply reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm carrying your child," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We're going to be parents." Wyatt's expression went through a rapid series of changes: shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally pure joy. He stood so abruptly his chair fell backward, came around the table, and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that made her throat tight with emotion. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I'm sure. 3 months along, I think. The baby should come in January or February." He kissed her then, sweetly and reverently, and when he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes. "We're going to be parents," he repeated, as though testing the words. "We're going to have a family." "We already are a family," Lydia corrected gently. "This baby is just making it official." The pregnancy changed the dynamic of the ranch in subtle ways. Wyatt became even more protective, insisting Lydia not ride alone or lift anything heavy. Pete and the hands treated her with careful courtesy, as though she might break if they looked at her wrong. And Lydia, despite her frustration at being coddled, felt a deep sense of rightness about bringing a child into this life they'd built. In September, they held the first annual cattle drive, moving the combined herds to market in a massive undertaking that required every hand they could hire. Wyatt rode out with the drive, while Lydia stayed behind to manage both ranches. And for 3 weeks, she was solely responsible for an operation that employed 8 men and covered 6,500 acres. She discovered she was good at it, better than good, actually. She made decisions quickly, solved problems efficiently, and earned the respect of the men who worked for her through competence rather than authority. When a fence broke and cattle wandered into the neighboring property, she negotiated their return diplomatically. When supplies ran low, she improvised solutions. When a mare went into difficult labor, she assisted with the birth and saved both horse and foal. By the time Wyatt returned with the news that they'd sold the cattle for excellent prices, more than enough to make their first payment with money left over, Lydia had proven to herself and everyone else that she was more than just the boss's wife. She was a rancher in her own right, capable of running the operation solo if circumstances demanded it. "You're amazing," Wyatt said when she showed him the detailed accounts she'd kept during his absence, every penny tracked and accounted for. "I knew you were competent, but Lydia, this is exceptional work." "I had good teachers," she said modestly, though she felt proud of what she'd accomplished. "And I was motivated. This is our ranch, our future. I want to protect it." "Our ranch," Wyatt repeated, and she heard the satisfaction in his voice. Not his ranch that she helped with, but theirs, jointly owned and operated. True partnership. The first payment was made in October, delivered personally by Wyatt to the county office with a sense of ceremony. They'd done it, survived the first 6 months of ownership, made enough to meet their obligations, and still had money left for winter provisions. 4 more years of this, Wyatt said as they celebrated quietly that evening, and the Standing Rock will be ours free and clear. "We'll make it," Lydia said confidently. "I know we will." Winter came again, but this time they were prepared. The herds were in better condition, the supplies more plentiful, the ranch infrastructure improved and reinforced. And when the first serious snow fell in late November, Lydia stood at the kitchen window of the High Valley Ranch house, their home, with Wyatt's arms around her and his hand resting on her swelling belly, and felt nothing but contentment. They weathered that winter better than the one before, losing only a handful of cattle to the cold and emerging into spring with their operation intact and thriving. And on a freezing night in early February, with a midwife from town and Wyatt pacing anxiously downstairs, Lydia gave birth to their first child, a daughter with dark hair and her mother's determination evident even in her newborn cries. They named her Sarah Catherine Mercer, after Lydia's mother and Wyatt's first wife, a gesture of respect for the past even as they claimed the future. Wyatt held his daughter with trembling hands, his hard face transformed by wonder and terror and overwhelming love. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." "She's ours," Lydia corrected, exhausted but happy beyond measure. "And she's going to grow up knowing she belongs to this land, that she's part of something bigger than herself." The years that followed blurred together in the way of busy, productive lives. Sarah was joined by a brother, Thomas, named for the man whose death had paradoxically given them this life. Then came another daughter, Catherine, and finally a second son, William. 4 children in 6 years, each one welcomed with joy and celebration, each one inheriting their parents' determination and love for the land. The ranch prospered under Lydia and Wyatt's joint management. They made their payments on time every year, weathered droughts and storms and market fluctuations through careful planning and stubborn perseverance. Pete became like family, a permanent fixture who helped raise the children and run the operation with the wisdom of experience. The original hands moved on to start their own ranches, but new ones came, drawn by the High Valley's reputation for fair treatment and honest wages. And slowly, almost without them noticing, the ranch became more than just a business. It became a community. Lydia started teaching the ranch children their letters and numbers, holding classes in the main house 3 days a week. The lessons grew as neighboring families heard about them and sent their children to learn. Within 2 years, Lydia had established a proper school in a building Wyatt constructed specifically for that purpose, and she hired a young teacher from back east to run it year-round. The school became a gathering point for families scattered across the territory. Sunday services were held there when the circuit preacher came through. Community meetings happened there when decisions needed to be made about shared resources like roads and water access. And gradually, what had been isolated ranches became something resembling a town, with the High Valley at its center. In the 4th year of their marriage, with the final payment on the Standing Rock approaching, Wyatt came to Lydia with another proposal. "I've been talking to some of the other ranchers," he said. "There are 5 families within 30 miles who are struggling. Good people, hard workers, but they're on marginal land with limited water access. If they stay where they are, they'll fail within a few years." Lydia looked up from the account she was reviewing, already knowing where this was going. "What are you proposing?" "We subdivide part of the Standing Rock, sell parcels to these families at fair prices with generous payment terms, help them get established with access to our water, our resources, our expertise." He sat down across from her, his expression earnest. "We'd make less profit in the short term, but long term, we'd have neighbors we can count on, a stronger community, and people invested in the success of this whole region." It was exactly the kind of thinking that had made Lydia fall in love with him, the ability to see beyond immediate profit to long-term sustainability, the understanding that helping others succeed would ultimately benefit everyone. "How much land would we be selling?" she asked. "Maybe 1,000 acres total, divided into 4 or 5 parcels. We'd still have over 5,000 acres for ourselves, more than enough for our operation." Lydia did the calculations in her head. The money from the land sales could pay off the remaining balance on the Standing Rock and still leave them with capital for expansion or improvements. And the intangible benefits, reliable neighbors, a stronger community, the goodwill and cooperation that would come from helping struggling families, were worth more than money could measure. "Let's do it," she said. "But I have one condition." "What's that?" "We keep the land around the creek source. That stays ours, protected in perpetuity. We'll share water rights generously, but the actual source needs to remain under our control to prevent any future disputes." Wyatt smiled. "You're learning." I had a good teacher. The land sales went through, and by spring of their 5th year, the High Valley and its surrounding properties had transformed. 4 new families were established on good land with access to water and support. The community school was thriving with 20 children in attendance. A small general store had opened, run by a couple from Missouri, and there was talk of establishing a proper church building and maybe even a post office. And on a bright morning in June, Wyatt and Lydia made the final payment on the Standing Rock. The land was theirs, free and clear, and the relief and pride they felt was overwhelming. "We did it," Wyatt said, holding the paid-in-full documentation like it was made of gold. 5 years, exactly as we planned. The ranch is ours. Lydia took his hand, looking out at the valley that had become their home, their legacy, their gift to their children. "It was always ours," she corrected gently, "from the moment we decided to fight for it together." That evening, they gathered the whole ranch family, Pete, the Hands, the neighboring families, even some folks from Dry Creek who'd made the journey out for a celebration. They roasted an entire steer, and there was music and dancing and laughter that echoed across the valley. Annie Caldwell, who'd married a rancher from the next county and had 3 children of her own now, pulled Lydia aside during the celebration. "Do you remember that day you arrived in Dry Creek?" Annie asked. "How lost and frightened you were." "I remember," Lydia said, watching her children play with the other ranch kids, seeing Wyatt talking with Pete and the neighbors about next year's plans. "I thought my life was over. And look at you now. Look at all of this." Annie gestured at the celebration, the ranch, the community. "You didn't just survive, Lydia. You built something extraordinary." "We built it," Lydia corrected. "Wyatt and I, together. That's the only way anything worth having gets built, through partnership and faith and refusing to give up when things get hard." As the sun set over the mountains and the celebration continued into the evening, Lydia stood on the porch of the main house and thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Boston with nothing but desperation and a stranger's promise. She'd arrived in Dry Creek to find that promise broken and her future uncertain. She'd been offered charity, had chosen dignity instead, and had found something far more valuable than security. She'd found purpose. She'd found love. She'd found herself. Sarah appeared beside her, now 5 years old and already showing signs of becoming as stubborn and capable as her mother. "Mama, why are you standing here alone?" "Just thinking, sweetheart." "About what?" "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the best things in disguise. About how getting lost is sometimes the only way to find where you really belong." Sarah considered this with the seriousness of a child trying to understand adult wisdom. "I don't understand." "You will someday," Lydia promised, picking her up despite the girl's increasing weight. "When you're older and you have to make hard choices, you'll remember that sometimes what looks like disaster is actually opportunity. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite the fear." Wyatt joined them, slipping an arm around Lydia's waist, and together they watched the celebration, their family, their community, their legacy. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Lydia thought about the question seriously, about the life she'd left behind in Boston, the future as Thomas Brennan's wife that never materialized, all the other paths she might have taken. "Not a single one," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Good," Wyatt said, kissing her temple. "Because I have another idea I want to run by you." She laughed. "Of course you do. What is it this time?" "Well, there's this parcel of land about 40 miles north, excellent grazing, good water, going for a reasonable price." "Absolutely not," Lydia said, but she was smiling. "We just paid off the Standing Rock. We're not taking on more debt." "I'm just saying we should look at it. No commitment, just exploring possibilities." "You're incorrigible. You love it." I do," she admitted, leaning into him. "I really do." The years continued to pass, marked by growth and change and the small daily victories that build into something larger. The children grew, learning to ride and rope and manage cattle under their father's patient instruction, while their mother taught them reading and arithmetic and the importance of keeping detailed records. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. And the community around it flourished, with new families arriving, businesses establishing themselves,
and the beginnings of what might someday become a proper town. On a morning in late summer, 15 years after Lydia had first arrived in Dry Creek, she stood on the ridge above the high valley with Wyatt, watching their children work with the cattle below. Sarah, now 20, was riding beside Pete, learning the finer points of herd management. Thomas, 17, was repairing fence with the same methodical competence his father had shown at that age. The younger ones were helping sort calves, their laughter carrying up the hill. "We did it," Lydia said softly. "Everything we dreamed about, everything we worked for. We actually did it." "We're not done yet," Wyatt said, though his tone was satisfied rather than restless. "There's always more to build, more to improve." "I know. But take a moment to appreciate what we've already accomplished. This ranch, this community, our children, it's extraordinary, Wyatt. We've built something that will outlast us, something that matters." He pulled her close, and they stood together overlooking the valley that had become so much more than just land to them. It was legacy and future, struggle and triumph, the physical manifestation of two people's determination to create something meaningful from nothing. "Do you ever think about how it started?" Wyatt asked. "About that day I found you in Patterson's store, desperate and alone?" "Sometimes. But mostly I think about everything that came after. The work we did, the challenges we overcame, the life we built together." Lydia rested her head against his shoulder. "I was supposed to marry Thomas Brennan and help him run the Standing Rock. Instead, I married you and we run both ranches together. The destination was similar, but the journey made all the difference." "Thomas would have been good to you," Wyatt said, as he had many times over the years. "But I like to think you and I are better together than either of us could have been with anyone else." "We are," Lydia agreed. "We're exactly what each other needed, even if we didn't know it at the time." They remained on the ridge as the sun climbed higher, watching their children work, their ranch thrive, their community grow. And Lydia thought about the woman she'd been at 24, stepping off a train with $4 and nowhere to go. And she felt nothing but gratitude for every twist of fate that had brought her here. She'd come west looking for survival and found purpose instead. She'd expected charity and received partnership. She'd feared loneliness and discovered love. The frontier had tested her in ways she couldn't have imagined, had demanded everything she had to give and then demanded more. But it had also rewarded her beyond measure, had given her a life richer and fuller and more meaningful than any she could have constructed in the safe, narrow confines of Boston. She was Lydia Mercer now, rancher and teacher and mother and wife, co-owner of one of the most successful operations in the territory, founder of a community that was still growing, partner to a man who valued her strength as much as her love. And as she stood on that ridge with Wyatt's arm around her, and their children working below, and the vast sky stretching overhead, Lydia understood with perfect clarity that she was exactly where she belonged. She'd arrived one day too late to marry Thomas Brennan, and that single day's delay had changed everything. What had seemed like catastrophic misfortune had actually been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life. Sometimes, she thought, the universe knows what it's doing even when we don't. Sometimes getting lost is the only way to find home, and sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of something extraordinary. Below them, Sarah called out something to her brother, and their laughter rose on the wind. The cattle moved across the pasture in their endless cycle of grazing and rest. The creek sparkled in the sunlight, the water that had been worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. This was their legacy, not just land and livestock, but the community they'd built, the children they'd raised, the example they'd set of what could be accomplished through partnership and determination and refusing to accept defeat. "Come on," Wyatt said, taking her hand. "Let's go help the kids. There's still work to do." "There's always work to do," Lydia replied. But she was smiling as they walked down the ridge together, hand in hand, toward the life they'd built from nothing but courage and hope and stubborn faith in each other. And somewhere in the wind that swept across the high valley, Lydia thought she could feel Thomas Brennan's approval, the blessing of a good man whose death had inadvertently given her the greatest gift, the chance to become who she was always meant to be. The sun climbed higher, the day stretched ahead full of work and possibility, and Lydia Mercer walked forward into her future with her husband beside her and her children waiting below, ready to face whatever came next with the same determination that had carried them this far. She'd come west as a bride with nowhere left to go,
She'd become a rancher, a mother, a pillar of her community, and the co-architect of a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. And that, she thought as they reached the valley floor and Sarah rode up to greet them with news about the herd, was more than enough. It was everything.